When billionaire CEO Evelyn Cross's private jet plunged into a mountain lake, she had seconds to live. The man who dove through shattered glass to pull her from the sinking cockpit disappeared before she could learn his name, but the engineering blueprints in his remote cabin would soon reveal a connection that could destroy them both. This is the story of a rescue that uncovered a deadly secret, a cover-up that killed innocent people, and two strangers forced to choose between silence and justice. If you're ready for a story about courage, betrayal, and the price of truth, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The morning mist hung low over Lake Sentinel, turning the water into liquid mercury under the early sun. Caleb Morgan stood at the edge of his weathered dock, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching his 7-year-old son skip stones across the glassy surface. The mountains rose around them like ancient sentinels, their peaks still dusted with last winter's snow, and for a moment, just a moment, Caleb allowed himself to believe that this peace might last. "Dad, watch this one!" Noah called out, his small arm winding back with the earnest determination of childhood. The stone left his hand in a perfect arc, kissing the water once, twice, 3 times before sinking beneath the surface. "That's my boy," Caleb said, his voice rough with the kind of pride that only single fathers understand, the pride that carries an undercurrent of fear, the constant awareness that he's all this child has left in the world. Noah beamed, his gap-toothed smile a mirror of his mother's, and Caleb felt the familiar ache in his chest. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the crash, 3 years since he'd buried his wife, 3 years since he'd walked away from everything he'd built in the world of aerospace engineering, 3 years of hiding in these mountains, trying to convince himself that anonymity was the same thing as peace. The sound came first, a low whine that didn't belong to the wilderness symphony of birds and wind. Caleb's head snapped up, his engineer's brain automatically cataloging the noise even as his body tensed with instinct. Aircraft engine. Twin turbines. High-altitude descent, but the pitch was wrong. The harmonics distorted in a way that made his blood run cold. "Noah, come here," he said sharply, setting down his mug. "But Dad, I almost—" "Now." Something in his father's tone made Noah abandon his stones and hurry back to the dock. Caleb's eyes scanned the morning sky, searching for the source of that increasingly desperate mechanical scream. Then he saw it, a white dart against the blue, trailing a thin ribbon of smoke, descending far too fast and at entirely the wrong angle. "Oh God," Caleb breathed. His mind raced through the calculations automatically. Trajectory, speed, impact point. The jet was coming down, and unless the pilot could pull off a miracle, it was going to hit the lake. "Dad, what is that?" Noah's voice trembled. "Go to the cabin, right now. Don't argue. Don't look back. Just run." "But, run!" Noah bolted toward the cabin, his small legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. Caleb didn't watch him go. His eyes were locked on the descending aircraft, watching it fight against gravity and physics and the cruel inevitability of mechanical failure. The jet was maybe 30 seconds from impact, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch. Except Caleb Morgan had never been very good at watching. He kicked off his boots even as the jet screamed lower, his fingers already working at his belt. The aircraft was a Gulfstream G650. He recognized the silhouette, which meant it likely carried anywhere from 8 to 14 passengers. The pilot was good, he could tell that much. They were trying to use the lake as a runway, attempting to glide the crippled bird to a controlled water landing. It almost worked. The jet's belly kissed the surface of Lake Sentinel with a sound like thunder being born. Water exploded upward in twin geysers as the aircraft hydroplaned across the surface, its momentum carrying it forward even as the water fought to slow it down. Metal shrieked. The starboard wing caught a wave and the entire fuselage pivoted, spinning like a skipped stone, and then the nose dipped and the lake swallowed it whole. Caleb was already running. His bare feet pounded against the dock's weathered planks, and then he was airborne, diving into water so cold it felt like knives against his skin. He surfaced, gasping, and struck out toward where the jet had disappeared. The water was already darkening with fuel, creating an oily rainbow sheen that spread across the surface like a disease. His engineer's mind calculated even as his arms pulled him forward. The The lake was deep here, maybe 80 feet, and the jet would sink fast. He had minutes at most, probably less. The cabin would be flooding, the electrical systems would be shorting out, and anyone still alive inside would be fighting against their seatbelts in rising water while their lungs screamed for air. He reached the impact site just as the tail section slipped beneath the surface. Without hesitation, Caleb filled his lungs and dove. The cold was worse below the surface, a bone-deep chill that made his muscles want to seize. The water was murky, with disturbed sediment and leaking fuel, but he could see the white shape of the fuselage descending into the gloom like a fallen angel. He kicked harder, following it down, his ears popping as the pressure increased. The cockpit window was shattered. That's where most of the water would be entering. Caleb angled toward it, his lungs already beginning to burn. Through the broken glass, he could see a figure slumped against the controls, long dark hair floating like seaweed in the flooded cabin. The pilot or a passenger, he couldn't tell, but they weren't moving. His fingers found the edge of the shattered window, and he pulled himself through, ignoring the way the remaining glass shards bit into his palms. The cabin was a chaos of floating debris. Loose papers, electronic devices, seat cushions, all drifting in the artificial current created by the flooding. The figure in the pilot's seat was a woman. He could see that now, wearing an expensive business suit that was already ruined by the lake water. Her seatbelt held her upright, but her head lolled forward, unconscious or worse. Caleb's fingers fumbled with the belt release. His vision was starting to narrow at the edges, his body demanding air that wasn't there to give. The buckle finally came free, and the woman drifted forward into his arms. She was slight, maybe 5'6", but dead weight in the water. He wrapped one arm around her chest and pushed off from the pilot's seat, kicking back toward the broken window. His lungs were screaming now, involuntary spasms trying to force him to breathe water instead of air. The window seemed impossibly far away, the surface beyond it a distant dream of light. His legs kicked mechanically, propelling them upward, and his free arm pulled against the water with strokes that were becoming increasingly desperate. They cleared the fuselage. The tail section was disappearing into the depths below them, the lake claiming its prize. Caleb kicked harder, angling toward the surface, toward oxygen, toward life. The woman in his arms wasn't breathing. He could feel the terrible stillness of her chest against his forearm, but he couldn't think about that, couldn't process anything except the need to reach the air. His head broke the surface and he gasped, dragging oxygen into his starved lungs in great heaving gulps. The woman's head lolled back against his shoulder, her face pale and lips blue. He adjusted his grip, ensuring her face stayed above water, and began the long swim back to shore. The dock seemed miles away. His legs felt like lead, his arms like rubber, but he kept swimming, kept pulling them both toward safety. Behind him, the last pieces of the jet disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only spreading fuel and floating debris to mark where it had been. His feet finally touched bottom, and he half walked, half crawled up the sloping lake bed, dragging the unconscious woman with him. He laid her out on the rocky shore and immediately checked for a pulse. Nothing. Her chest wasn't moving. Water dribbled from her blue lips. "Come on," Caleb muttered, tilting her head back to open her airway. He'd learned CPR as part of his engineering safety certification, though he'd never imagined actually using it. His hands found their position on her sternum, 2 fingers above the base of the breastbone, and he began compressions. 30 of them, hard and fast, forcing water and air through her lungs. He pinched her nose and gave 2 rescue breaths, watching her chest rise with the forced air. Nothing. He went back to compressions, counting under his breath, his wet hand slipping slightly against the sodden fabric of her suit jacket. "Don't you dare die," he growled, giving her 2 more breaths. "I didn't pull you out of that wreck just so you could quit on me now." Another round of compressions. His shoulders were burning, his arms shaking with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. He'd already failed one woman he couldn't save. He wasn't going to fail another. The woman suddenly convulsed, water erupting from her mouth as her body fought to clear her lungs. Caleb rolled her onto her side, supporting her as she coughed and gagged, bringing up what seemed like half the lake. Her eyes flickered open. Gray, he noticed distantly, the color of winter storms, and focused on his face with the confused desperation of someone who wasn't sure if they were alive or dead. "You're okay," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "You're safe. Just breathe." She tried to speak, but only more water came up. He kept his hand on her shoulder, anchoring her to consciousness, to life, to the shore beneath her. Her breathing gradually steadied, becoming less ragged, and some color began to return to her face. "The pilot," she finally managed, her voice a raw whisper. "Marcus, is he—" "I'm sorry," Caleb said quietly. "You're the only one I could reach." Something flickered across her face. Grief, guilt, or some combination of both. She closed her eyes, and for a moment Caleb thought she might pass out again. Then she opened them, focusing on him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You saved my life," she said. "You would have done the same." "No," she said, and there was a bitter certainty in her voice. "No, I wouldn't have. Most people wouldn't have." Before Caleb could respond, Noah's voice cut through the morning air. "Dad! Dad!" Caleb's head snapped around to see his son standing at the edge of the dock, his small face white with fear. "Stay there," he called back. "Everything's okay." But everything wasn't okay. Even as he spoke, he could hear them, sirens in the distance, growing louder. Someone had seen the crash, called it in. Within minutes, this quiet stretch of shoreline would be swarming with emergency responders, investigators, media. All the things Caleb had spent 3 years avoiding. The woman was looking at Noah now, then back at Caleb, and he could see her mind working despite the trauma and the cold. She was reading the situation, understanding the panic in his eyes, even if she didn't understand the reason behind it. "Thank you," she said simply. "For my life." "You need medical attention," Caleb replied, already standing. "When the EMTs get here." "What's your name?" she interrupted. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to lie, to disappear, to protect the fragile anonymity he'd built. But he'd just breathed air into this woman's lungs, had felt her heart restart under his hands, and somehow lying seemed like a betrayal of that intimate act of saving a life. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Morgan." She opened her mouth to respond, but Caleb was already moving, jogging back toward the dock where Noah waited. He scooped up his son, feeling the boy's small body trembling against his chest, and headed for the cabin without looking back. "Is she going to be okay?" Noah asked. "Yeah, buddy, she's going to be fine." Caleb reached the cabin and pushed through the door, his mind already racing. The sirens were closer now, maybe 5 minutes out. He needed to grab Noah's inhaler, his medication, maybe some clothes. They might need to leave, to find somewhere else to— "Dad, you're bleeding." Caleb looked down at his hands and saw that Noah was right. His palms were cut from the broken cockpit glass, blood mixing with lake water, dripping onto the worn wooden floor of their cabin. He'd been so focused on the rescue, on CPR, on getting away, that he hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing," he said. But Noah's eyes were wide and frightened, and Caleb forced himself to slow down, to breathe. Running would only make things worse. He'd pulled a woman from a crashed jet, that was all. A good deed. There was no reason anyone would connect it to anything else. No reason his past would suddenly rise up to meet him. Unless they looked too closely. Unless someone recognized his name. Unless they saw the blueprints. Caleb's eyes cut to his makeshift office in the corner of the cabin. Really just a desk made from sawhorses and an old door, where 3 years of obsessive investigation lay spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Schematics. Calculations. Design flaw analyses. All related to the same model of aircraft that had just crashed into his lake. The same model that had killed his wife. He crossed to the desk in 3 quick strides and began gathering papers, shoving them into a drawer, into a filing box, anywhere they wouldn't be immediately visible. Noah watched from the doorway, understanding without being told that this was important, that something was wrong. "Dad, what's happening?" "Nothing, buddy. We're just going to have some visitors, and I need to tidy up a bit." "But you said your work was important. You said—" "I know what I said." Caleb's hands were shaking now, and he couldn't tell if it was from the cold water or the fear or the sudden, crushing weight of coincidence. Of all the aircraft in all the world, why did it have to be that model? Why here? Why now? The sirens were right outside now, the sound of multiple vehicles pulling up to his cabin. Car doors slammed. Voices shouted commands. Caleb shoved the last of the papers into a drawer and turned to his son, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Everything's going to be fine," he said. "Just stay inside while I talk to them, okay?" Noah nodded, but his eyes were frightened, and Caleb hated himself for putting that fear there. He stepped outside onto the porch, just as a fire truck and 2 ambulances came to a stop in a small clearing. Emergency responders were already pouring out, moving with practiced efficiency, and a woman in a paramedic uniform was jogging toward him. "Sir, we got a report of a plane crash on this lake. Are you—" "She's down by the shore," Caleb interrupted, pointing. "Unconscious when I pulled her out, but breathing now. No other survivors that I could reach." The paramedic's eyes widened slightly at this information, then she was speaking into her radio, calling for backup, for equipment, for whatever resources they needed to handle a plane crash victim. More EMTs rushed past Caleb, heading for the shore, leaving him standing on his porch, watching his quiet life disintegrate. A man in a sheriff's uniform approached, his weathered face kind but professional. "I'm Sheriff Tom Hastings. You're the one who pulled her out?" "Yes, sir." "Hell of a thing to do. She's lucky you were here." The sheriff pulled out a notepad. "I'm going to need to ask you some questions. Standard procedure for something like this." "Of course." Caleb's mind was racing, trying to anticipate what questions might come, what connections might be made. Just stick to the facts. Just tell the truth about what happened, nothing more. "Your name?" "Caleb Morgan." The sheriff wrote it down, and Caleb watched the pen form letters that could potentially unlock his entire past if anyone bothered to look. But why would they? He was a good Samaritan, a hero even. There was no reason for suspicion. "How long have you lived on this property, Mr. Morgan?" "About 3 years." "And you witnessed the crash?" "Heard it first. The engine sounded wrong. Then I saw it coming down." The sheriff was taking notes, his expression neutral. "Did you see what caused it? Any sign of mechanical failure, bird strike, anything like that?" Caleb's jaw tightened involuntarily. He'd seen exactly what caused it, or at least he could make a very educated guess. The pitch of those engines, the way the jet had lost power, the pattern of the descent. He'd written a report about this exact failure mode 3.5 years ago, a report that had been ignored, dismissed, buried by people who valued profit over safety. But he couldn't say that, couldn't explain how he knew what he knew without revealing who he used to be. "No, sir," Caleb said carefully. "Just saw it coming down." "And you dove in? Water's got to be pretty cold this time of year." "Didn't really think about it, just somebody needed help." The sheriff studied him for a moment, and Caleb had the uncomfortable feeling of being read like a book. Tom Hastings had probably been doing this job for decades, had probably developed a sixth sense for when people were hiding something. But what could he do? Caleb hadn't broken any laws. He'd saved a life. End of story. "You're a brave man, Mr. Morgan," the sheriff finally said. "Not many folks would have had the guts to do what you did. Anyone would have done the same." "That's where you're wrong." The sheriff closed his notepad. "I'm going to need you to stick around for a bit. The NTSB will probably want to talk to you, and I imagine the woman you saved is going to want to thank you properly once she's coherent." That's what Caleb was afraid of. Down by the shore, the paramedics had the woman on a stretcher, loading her into the ambulance. Even from a distance, Caleb could see her trying to sit up, trying to look back toward his cabin. One of the EMTs gently pushed her back down, but she fought them, her head turning, searching, looking for him. The ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, sirens wailing as it disappeared down the mountain road. Caleb watched it go and felt a strange twist in his gut, relief that she was getting medical help, and something else, something that felt almost like regret. "Mr. Morgan?" He turned to find a woman in an expensive suit picking her way across his clearing, an official-looking badge hanging from her neck. She was younger than him, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of composed expression that came from dealing with disasters professionally. "I'm Sarah Chen, NTSB investigator. I'll be leading the investigation into this crash." She extended her hand and Caleb shook it, noting the strength in her grip. "I understand you're the one who pulled Ms. Cross from the aircraft?" "Ms. Cross?" "Evelyn Cross, the woman you saved. She's the CEO of Cross Aerospace." The world tilted slightly under Caleb's feet. Of course she was. Of course the woman he'd pulled from the lake would be the CEO of the very company whose negligence had killed his wife. The universe had always had a cruel sense of humor, but this was beyond irony. This was cosmic malice. I didn't know, he managed. No reason you would have. But I mention it because this crash is going to attract significant attention. Media, corporate investigators, probably federal scrutiny given Ms. Cross's profile. Sarah Chen's eyes were studying him carefully. The fact that you were here, that you were able to respond so quickly, and that you had the skills to successfully rescue her, that's going to raise some questions. I was just in the right place at the right time. Maybe. Or maybe you're more than just a guy who lives in a cabin by a lake. She pulled out a business card and handed it to him. I'll need to schedule a formal interview with you in the next day or two. In the meantime, if you remember anything about the crash, any details, no matter how small, give me a call. Caleb took the card, feeling its weight like a stone. I'll do that. Sarah Chen nodded and turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Morgan. What do you do for a living? There it was, the question he'd been dreading. He could lie, tell her he was a handyman, a fishing guide, anything but the truth. But investigators like Sarah Chen didn't ask questions they didn't already suspect the answers to. She'd run his name through databases, would find his old employment records, his engineering credentials, his published papers. The truth would come out eventually. Better to control the narrative now than have it discovered later. I'm retired, he said carefully. Used to work in aerospace engineering. Sarah Chen's eyebrows rose fractionally. Is that so? What kind of aerospace engineering? Structural analysis, safety systems, that kind of thing. For which company? Caleb met her eyes steadily. Cross Aerospace. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sarah Chen's expression didn't change, but Caleb could see her mind working, connections forming, questions multiplying. Well, she said finally, I think that formal interview just became a lot more important. Don't leave town, Mr. Morgan. She walked away, leaving Caleb standing on his porch watching his carefully constructed isolation crumble around him. Behind him, he heard the cabin door creak open and felt Noah's small hand slip into his. Dad, are we in trouble? Caleb looked down at his son, 7 years old, asthmatic, still mourning the mother he'd lost in a crash that should never have happened, and felt a fierce surge of protectiveness that bordered on rage. No, buddy, he said, squeezing Noah's hand. We're not in trouble. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. They were in more trouble than Noah could possibly understand, because the woman he'd saved wasn't just any CEO. She was the daughter of the man who'd ignored his warnings, the heir to the company that valued profit over lives, the person who now held the power to either bury the truth forever or bring it screaming into the light. And Caleb had just pulled her from the wreckage of the same aircraft model that had killed his wife. The irony was so sharp it could cut. 3 hours later, the emergency responders had cleared out, leaving behind only tire tracks in the mud and a lake full of investigators in diving gear. Caleb stood in his kitchen making Noah a late lunch, grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food for a morning that had shattered their routine, when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but something made him answer anyway. Hello? Mr. Morgan, this is Robert Kane, head of security for Cross Aerospace. The voice was professional, clipped with an undertone of authority that expected to be obeyed. Ms. Cross is recovering at Mountain View Medical Center and has requested to see you. I'm prepared to send a car to your location to bring you to the hospital. That's not necessary. Ms. Cross was quite insistent. She wants to thank you personally for saving her life. Caleb looked at Noah, who was sitting at their small kitchen table trying to be brave, but failing to hide the worry in his eyes. The last thing his son needed was more disruption, more strangers, more reminders that their quiet life wasn't as safe as they'd pretended it was. Tell Ms. Cross she's welcome, but I can't leave my son right now. Maybe another time. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Morgan, I don't think you understand. When Evelyn Cross requests a meeting, it's not optional. Something cold settled in Caleb's stomach. Is that a threat? It's a reality. My job is to protect Ms. Cross and Cross Aerospace's interests. The fact that a former employee of the company happened to be perfectly positioned to rescue her from a crash of one of our aircraft, that raises questions that need answers. I live here. I've lived here for 3 years. That's not positioning, that's coincidence. Maybe. But Ms. Cross wants to look you in the eye when she thanks you, and I want to look you in the eye when I decide whether you're a hero or something else." Robert Kane's voice hardened. "The car will be there in an hour. I suggest you be ready." The line went dead. Caleb stared at his phone, anger and fear warring in his chest. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. The scrutiny, the questions, the erosion of the walls he'd built between his past and his present. He'd known that pulling Evelyn Cross from that jet would have consequences, but he'd done it anyway because the alternative was letting another person die. And now that person was using her power to drag him back into a world he'd fought so hard to escape. "Dad?" Noah's voice was small. "Do you have to go?" Caleb crossed to the table and knelt beside his son's chair, taking both small hands in his own. "Yeah, buddy. I have to go talk to the lady I helped this morning. But Mrs. Patterson next door will come stay with you, and I'll be back before dinner, I promise." "You said promises are sacred." "They are. And I keep my promises, don't I?" Noah nodded slowly, but his fingers tightened around Caleb's. "I don't want you to go." "I know, but sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do because they're the right thing. Can you be brave for me?" Another nod, this one more reluctant. Caleb hugged his son close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, cheap drugstore brand that smelled like artificial apples, and felt the weight of every decision that had led them to this moment. If he'd spoken up more forcefully 3 years ago, if he'd gone over his supervisor's head, if he'd leaked the information to the press instead of following proper channels, would Emily still be alive? Would he and Noah be hiding in these mountains? But he had followed the rules, had trusted the system, and the system had ground his warnings into dust beneath the wheels of profit margins and quarterly earnings reports. The car arrived exactly 1 hour later, a black SUV with tinted windows that looked aggressively out of place on his dirt driveway. Mrs. Patterson had arrived 15 minutes earlier, a kind widow in her 70s who sometimes watched Noah when Caleb needed to go into town for supplies. She'd asked no questions, just patted his hand and told him to take his time. The driver who emerged from the SUV was ex-military. Caleb could tell that immediately from his bearing and the way his eyes swept the property, cataloging threats. He was joined by another man, this one clearly Robert Kane, based on the expensive suit and the cold assessment in his gaze. "Mr. Morgan," Kane said, not offering his hand. "Thank you for cooperating. Didn't realize I had a choice." "Everyone has choices. Some are just easier than others." Kane gestured to the SUV. "Shall we?" The drive to Mountain View Medical Center took 40 minutes, most of it in silence. Caleb sat in the back seat, watching the mountains roll past, thinking about the woman waiting for him at the end of this journey. Evelyn Cross, CEO of Cross Aerospace, daughter of James Cross, the man who'd built the company from the ground up, and who'd signed the memo dismissing Caleb's safety concerns as overly cautious alarmism that fails to consider market realities. What would she remember from this morning? Would she recall his name? Would she know who he was, what he tried to do, what her father's company had cost him? Did she know her aircraft were killing people because of a flaw that could have been fixed 3 years ago? The hospital was modern and expensive, the kind of place that catered to wealthy patients who expected privacy and discretion. Kane led him through a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where media trucks had already started to gather. They took an elevator to the 4th floor and walked down a corridor that had been cleared of everyone except security personnel. They stopped outside a private room. Through the door's narrow window, Caleb could see a hospital bed and the shape of someone sitting up in it, but no details. "Some ground rules," Kane said. "This conversation is being recorded for security purposes. You don't touch Ms. Cross. You don't make any requests or demands. You answer her questions truthfully and completely. Understood? I'm not here to cause trouble." "See that you don't." Kane pushed open the door. "Ms. Cross, your visitor is here." Caleb stepped into the room and got his first clear look at the woman he'd saved. Evelyn Cross was older than he'd realized, probably early 40s, though her face had the kind of ageless quality that came from good genes and expensive skincare. Her dark hair was still damp, pulled back from a face that was pale but composed. Those gray eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to step back. And something flickered across her expression, recognition, maybe, or surprise. "You're younger than I thought," she said, her voice stronger than it had been on the shore. "When you were doing CPR, I thought, I don't know what I thought. That you were older, maybe. More weathered. I'm weathered enough, Caleb said. A small smile touched her lips. I imagine you are, Mr. Morgan. She gestured to a chair beside the bed. Please, sit. And Mr. Kane, you can wait outside. Ms. Cross, I really think... Outside, Robert. Mr. Morgan saved my life. I'm not afraid of him. Kane clearly wanted to argue, but something in his employer's voice stopped him. He nodded stiffly and left, closing the door behind him, but positioning himself where Caleb could see him through the window, watching. He's protective, Evelyn said, following Caleb's gaze. Sometimes excessively so, but he's good at his job, which is making sure I'm not a threat? Among other things. She studied him for a long moment. I want to thank you for what you did this morning. The doctors tell me I would have been dead in another 2 minutes. You gave me those minutes back. Anyone would have... Please don't say anyone would have done the same. It's statistically and demonstrably false. Most people would have called 911 and watched from shore. You dove into freezing water and pulled me out of a sinking aircraft. That's not normal. That's extraordinary. Caleb shifted uncomfortably in the chair. Your pilot, Marcus, you said his name was. I'm sorry I couldn't reach him. Something crossed Evelyn's face, grief, sharp and fresh. Marcus Reeves. He'd been flying for me for 8 years. He had 2 daughters. She paused, her hands tightening on the hospital blanket. The preliminary report says there was a catastrophic engine failure. Both turbines went out within seconds of each other, which apparently is almost impossible without... She trailed off, and Caleb filled in the blank in his head. Without sabotage, or without a fundamental design flaw that the company has been ignoring for years. I'm sorry for your loss, he said instead. Are you? The question was sharp, unexpected. Because my security team did a background check on you, Mr. Morgan. Very thorough. And they found some interesting information. You worked for Cross Aerospace from 2019 to 2022. Structural engineer specializing in safety systems analysis. You left the company 3 months after filing a rather controversial report about potential flaws in the G650 turbine mounting system. Caleb's heart was suddenly hammering against his ribs. That report was classified. I'm the CEO. Nothing is classified from me. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, ignoring the wince of pain the movement caused. 3 weeks after you left the company, your wife died in a crash of a G650, the same model aircraft I was just pulled from. The same model you'd tried to warn us about. The silence in the room was absolute. Caleb could hear his own breathing, too fast and too shallow, and the distant beep of medical equipment monitoring Evelyn's vital signs. Outside the window, Robert Kane was watching intently, his hand moving toward his jacket, toward whatever weapon he carried there. So here's what I need to know, Mr. Morgan, Evelyn continued, her voice quiet but hard as steel. Did you save me this morning because you're a good man? Or because you want something from me? Because if you think you can use this as leverage for some kind of lawsuit or media exposure or... My wife's name was Emily, Caleb interrupted, his own voice rougher than he'd intended. She was flying to Portland for her sister's wedding. The plane crashed on approach due to catastrophic engine failure, both turbines, just like what happened to your jet. Killed everyone on board, 93 people. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. A flicker of uncertainty, maybe even remorse. I filed that report 18 months before she died, Caleb continued. I documented the flaw in the turbine mounting system, showed how stress fractures could develop over time, calculated the failure rates. I gave your father everything he needed to ground the fleet and fix the problem, and he buried it because retrofitting would have cost the company billions and admitted liability. My father retired 2 years ago. I've been running this company since... And did you ever read my report? Did you ever follow up on why a senior engineer would resign rather than keep working for Cross Aerospace? Did you ever wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a reason we keep losing aircraft? The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire neither could put out. Evelyn's face had gone paler than before, and her hands were trembling slightly where they gripped the blanket. I've read every safety report filed in the last 2 years, she said quietly. Every incident analysis, every maintenance log, every internal audit. I've been trying to figure out why our safety record has been declining, why we keep having what the board calls random mechanical failures. I didn't know about your report because it was filed before I took over, and apparently my father's administration was very good at making inconvenient truths disappear. So what are you going to do about it? I don't know yet, Evelyn admitted, but I will tell you this, Mr. Morgan. If what you're saying is true, if there's a systemic flaw that we've been ignoring, then people are going to answer for it, including me if that's what the evidence shows. Caleb wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe, finally, someone with power would actually listen, actually act, actually hold the company accountable. But he'd believed in the system before, had trusted that the truth would matter, and it had cost him everything. Your safety team is going to investigate the crash, he said. They're going to find the same pattern they've found in every other incident, stress fractures in the turbine mounting brackets, accelerated by normal flight operations, leading to catastrophic failure. And then they're going to write another report that your board will bury, because the alternative is admitting that Cross Aerospace has been selling defective aircraft for years. Not if I have anything to say about it. You're one person against a board of directors, shareholders, insurance companies, federal regulators who've already signed off on the design. You think they're going to let you bring down a multi-billion-dollar company over the word of one disgraced engineer? Is that what you think you are? Disgraced? That's what your father called me when I refused to retract my report, right before he had security escort me out of the building. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something, truth maybe, or confirmation of suspicions she'd been harboring. Finally, she reached for a tablet on the bedside table and tapped at the screen with fingers that were steadier than they should have been for someone who'd nearly drowned a few hours ago. I'm sending you a file, she said. It's encrypted, password protected. The password is Marcus's birthday, August 7th, 1975. No spaces, no slashes. Caleb's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw the notification of a large file transfer. What is this? Every internal memo, email, and report related to G650 safety concerns from the past 5 years, including, apparently, your report that was supposed to have been destroyed. Evelyn met his eyes. I can't promise I can fix this. I can't promise justice for your wife or for Marcus or for the 93 other people who died because of decisions made before I had any power to stop them. But I can promise you this. I will read every word of what you wrote. I will follow every lead, chase down every cover-up, and if the evidence supports what you're saying, I will burn down my own company if that's what it takes to make it right. Why? The question came out harsher than Caleb intended. Why would you do that? This company is your legacy, your family's name. Why would you risk everything for the word of someone you met 6 hours ago? Because you dove into freezing water to save my life when you had every reason to let me drown. Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was something raw in her eyes. Because you lost your wife and you're still here, still trying to do the right thing even though it cost you everything. And because when I woke up on that shore and you were breathing air into my lungs, the first thing I thought was, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to be saved. The honesty of it hit Caleb like a physical blow. This wasn't the cold, calculating CEO he'd been expecting. This was someone who'd looked death in the face and found it wanting. Someone who maybe, just maybe, was as tired of lies as he was. My son is 7, Caleb said quietly. His name is Noah. He watched his mother's casket get lowered into the ground when he was 4 years old, and he's been having nightmares about planes ever since. If I do this, if I help you dig up what your company buried, there are going to be lawyers, media, investigations. They're going to come after me, try to discredit me, maybe even threaten my son to keep me quiet. Can you protect us from that? Yes. No hesitation, no qualification, just a simple promise that carried the weight of billions of dollars and institutional power. I will protect you and your son, whatever it takes. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd been given a second chance at life and was trying to figure out what to do with it. Saw someone who was maybe, possibly, tired of running a machine built on compromises and convenient lies. Saw someone who might actually mean what she said. Then I'll help you, he said. But we do this right. Full transparency, no backroom deals, no settling out of court to make it go away quietly. If we're going to burn it down, we burn it down in the daylight where everyone can see. Evelyn extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb shook it. Her grip was strong despite the hospital gown and the IV in her arm, and he felt something shift in the air between them. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. The foundation of something that might, with time and truth, become an alliance. "One more thing," Evelyn said as he stood to leave. "The media is already spinning this as a miraculous rescue, a local hero saving a CEO. They don't know yet about your history with the company. When they find out, and they will find out, it's going to become a story about conspiracy theories and revenge plots. They're going to try to make you into a villain. Let them. I stopped caring what people think about me when my wife died and no one believed me about why. I believe you, Mr. Morgan, for what it's worth." Caleb paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "We'll see if you still believe me when you've read everything in those files, when you understand how deep the rot goes, how many people knew and did nothing. When you realize that your father built this company on a foundation of acceptable casualties and corporate liability calculations. I already know it's going to be bad, but I need to know how bad. I need to know what I'm really running. Then I'll see you soon, Ms. Cross. Evelyn. If we're going to be partners in corporate demolition, you might as well call me Evelyn." "Partners," Caleb repeated, tasting the word. It felt strange in his mouth, dangerous and promising at the same time. "All right then, Evelyn, don't read those files alone. And when you're done, call me. Because what comes next is going to be worse than anything you're imagining." He left her there, pale and determined in her hospital bed, and walked past Robert Kane without a word. The security chief followed him to the elevator, down to the lobby, out to the SUV that would take him back to his cabin and his son and his precarious peace. As the hospital disappeared behind them, Caleb pulled out his phone and opened the encrypted file Evelyn had sent. 5 years of cover-ups, contained in 847 megabytes of data. 5 years of decisions that had killed his wife and 92 other people, and nearly killed Evelyn this morning. 5 years of truth that was finally going to see the light of day. He thought about Noah waiting at home, about the quiet life they'd built in the shadow of the mountains. Thought about how that life was about to explode into something much bigger and more dangerous than anything he'd intended when he'd pulled Evelyn Cross from the wreckage. But he'd made his choice. Had made it the moment he'd dove into that freezing lake, the moment he'd breathed life back into someone he could have let die. And now he had to see it through to whatever end was waiting on the other side of truth. The SUV wound through the mountains as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Caleb watched the light fade and thought about beginnings and endings, about how sometimes the only way forward was through the fire, and how sometimes, if you were very lucky or very cursed, the person you saved might be the only one with the power to help you burn down the lies that had destroyed your life. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, he would hold his son and explain, as best he could, that the quiet life was over, but that something better, something truer, might be waiting on the other side of the storm, if they survived it. The encrypted files took Caleb 3 nights to read completely. 3 nights of staying up after Noah fell asleep, his laptop screen casting blue light across the cabin's worn wooden walls, his coffee growing cold as he traced the paper trail of decisions that had killed his wife. The first night he read his own report, the one he'd filed 38 months ago, marked confidential and stamped with James Cross's signature authorizing its burial in a classified archive. Seeing his own words again, the careful calculations and urgent warnings, was like reading a letter from a ghost. He'd been so certain that facts would matter, that evidence would compel action. He'd been naive. The second night, he read the internal memos that followed his report. Engineering teams recommending immediate fleet grounding, cost analysis showing a retrofit would run $2.3 billion, legal assessments of liability exposure if the flaw became public knowledge, and then the executive decision: continue operations, increase insurance coverage, implement a quiet monitoring program for stress fractures, and characterize any failures as isolated incidents rather than systemic flaws. The third night, he read about the crashes. Not just Emily's flight, though that one was documented in brutal detail, but 6 others over the past 3 years. Different airlines, different routes, different victims. But the same failure mode every time: catastrophic turbine mounting bracket failure leading to engine separation. The NTSB had noted the pattern: Cross Aerospace's lawyers had explained it away as coincidental wear patterns within acceptable safety margins. 93 people on Emily's flight, 78 on a flight to Miami, 141 on an international route to Tokyo. The numbers blurred together until they stopped being numbers and became faces, families, futures that had been sacrificed on the altar of quarterly earnings reports. By the time dawn broke on the fourth morning, Caleb had compiled his own analysis, a comprehensive breakdown of every memo, every cover-up, every decision point where someone could have stopped the deaths but chose profit instead. His hands were shaking with exhaustion and rage as he encrypted his findings and sent them back to Evelyn with a single line of text. "This is worse than I thought. We need to meet." Her response came within an hour. "My cabin. Tomorrow evening. Come alone." Caleb stared at the message, something cold settling in his stomach. Her cabin. Not her office, not a conference room, not somewhere with lawyers and security and official protocols. Somewhere private, off the record, away from the eyes of the board members who'd rather see this evidence disappear than see the light of day. It could be a trap. Could be Evelyn deciding that the easier path was to silence the whistleblower rather than implode her own company. Robert Kane had made it clear he was willing to do whatever it took to protect Cross Aerospace's interests, and a former employee with a grudge dying in a tragic accident wouldn't be that hard to arrange. But Caleb had stopped living cautiously the moment he'd pulled Evelyn from that wreckage. Forward was the only direction left. The next evening, he left Noah with Mrs. Patterson again, told her it was a business meeting, that he'd be back late, that she should call his cell if there was any problem with Noah's breathing. The inhaler was on the kitchen counter. The emergency numbers were on the fridge, and his son's worried eyes followed him to the door. "You're doing important stuff, aren't you, Dad?" Noah asked, his small voice trying to sound brave. "Yeah, buddy, important stuff. Like what you used to do before Mom." Caleb knelt down, meeting his son's eyes. "Something like that. Trying to make things safer for people. Make sure what happened to Mom doesn't happen to anyone else." Noah considered this with the serious expression of a child forced to grow up too fast. "She would want you to do that." The simplicity of it, the absolute faith in his 7-year-old's voice, nearly broke Caleb's carefully maintained composure. He pulled Noah into a fierce hug, breathing in that artificial apple shampoo smell, feeling the fragile bird bone structure of his son's shoulders. "I love you more than anything in this world," Caleb said. "You know that, right?" "I know, Dad. I love you too." 20 minutes later, Caleb was driving his battered pickup truck up a mountain road that made his own driveway look like a highway. Evelyn's cabin turned out to be a sprawling timber frame structure that probably cost more than most people's houses, perched on a ridge with a view of 3 valleys. Security cameras tracked his approach, and when he pulled into the circular driveway, Robert Kane was already waiting on the front porch. "Mr. Morgan," Kane said, his voice flat and professional, "I'll need you to leave your phone in your vehicle." "Not happening." "Ms. Cross insists. This conversation is private." "Then Ms. Cross can trust that I'm not recording anything, or we can have this conversation another time." Caleb kept his hands visible, but his posture firm. He wasn't giving up his only lifeline to the outside world, not up here in the mountains where a body could disappear and no one would find it for weeks. Kane's jaw tightened, but after a moment he touched his earpiece and listened to something Caleb couldn't hear. "Fine, but if I see you reach for that phone, this meeting ends immediately." Caleb followed Kane through the cabin, past vaulted ceilings and expensive art, through a gourmet kitchen that probably saw more caterers than cooking, out onto a deck that overlooked a spectacular vista of darkening mountains. Evelyn stood at the railing, her back to them, wearing jeans and a sweater that made her look more human than the CEO in the hospital bed had seemed. "That'll be all, Robert," she said without turning around. "Ms. Cross, I really think—" "I said that'll be all." Kane left with obvious reluctance, his footsteps heavy on the deck boards. Evelyn waited until the sound faded before turning to face Caleb. She looked tired, he noticed, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from having your worldview shattered and trying to pick up the pieces. "I read everything," she said without preamble. "Your analysis, the memos, the accident reports, all of it." "And?" "And you were right about all of it." Her hands gripped the railing, knuckles white. My father didn't just ignore your warnings. He actively suppressed them, threatened engineers who agreed with you, paid off NTSB inspectors to classify the failures as pilot error or maintenance issues, built an entire infrastructure of lies to protect the company's reputation and stock price. So what are you going to do about it? Evelyn turned back to the view, her profile sharp against the fading light. That's the question, isn't it? I could take this to the board, but half of them already know. Could go to federal regulators, but they've been complicit in the cover-up. Could leak it to the media, but that would cause a panic that could bring down the entire aerospace sector and put thousands of people out of work. Or you could ground the fleet, Caleb said, his voice harder than intended. Issue an immediate recall, retrofit every aircraft with the fix, and accept whatever consequences come from telling the truth. That would bankrupt the company, void our government contracts, expose us to hundreds of wrongful death lawsuits, destroy 50 years of my family's legacy in a matter of weeks. Your father's legacy is built on dead bodies. Maybe it deserves to be destroyed. The words hung between them like a physical presence. Evelyn's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Caleb thought she might ask him to leave, might retreat back into the comfortable fiction that problems could be managed and consequences could be contained. Instead, she laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. You want to know the worst part? I've been CEO for 2 years. 2 years of wondering why our safety record kept declining, why we kept having these random incidents, why the engineering teams seemed demoralized and afraid to speak up. And not once did I think to dig deep enough to find this. Not once did I question whether maybe the problems were institutional rather than coincidental. You were lied to by people you trusted. That's not an excuse. I'm the CEO. The responsibility stops with me, whether I knew or not. She finally looked at him, and there was something raw in her gray eyes. My father built this company from nothing. He was my hero growing up, brilliant, driven, someone who could solve any problem through sheer force of will. Finding out he was also someone who could look at your report and decide that fixing the problem was more expensive than paying off crash victims' families, it's like learning the person you thought you knew never really existed. Caleb moved to stand beside her at the railing, keeping a careful distance between them. My wife used to say that people are capable of both extraordinary kindness and terrible cruelty, sometimes within the same day, that we're all just making choices and hoping the good ones outnumber the bad ones. Sounds like she was wise. She was. She was also on one of your planes when it fell out of the sky because your father decided that, too. $3 billion was too much to spend on human lives. The accusation should have felt satisfying, but it just tasted like ash in Caleb's mouth. Evelyn flinched as if struck, but didn't look away. I can't fix what my father did, she said quietly. I can't bring back your wife or the other victims, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I can burn down the structure that allowed this to happen and build something better from the ashes. Pretty words, but I've heard pretty words before, right before lawyers and PR teams made the problems disappear. Then let me prove it. Evelyn pulled out her phone and tapped at the screen. I'm sending you something. Another encrypted file, but this one isn't evidence of what happened. It's a plan for what happens next. Caleb's phone buzzed. He pulled it out warily, half expecting Kane to come bursting back through the door at this violation of protocols. But the deck remained empty except for the two of them and the gathering darkness. The file contained a detailed strategy document, legal steps, regulatory notifications, media statements, timeline for fleet grounding, and retrofit implementation. It was comprehensive, aggressive, and would absolutely destroy Cross Aerospace as a going concern. The estimated cost ran to $8 billion, well beyond the company's liquid assets. Bankruptcy was inevitable. You'd lose everything, Caleb said, scrolling through the document. Not everything. I'd lose a company that was built on compromises I can't live with anymore, but I'd keep my integrity. I'd keep the ability to look at myself in the mirror. Evelyn took the phone from his hands and closed the file. But I need your help to do this right. I need someone who understands the technical side, who can't be bought off or intimidated, who has standing to speak as both an engineer and a victim. I need you to be the face of this, to stand up publicly and tell your story. You want me to testify. I want you to lead the independent review, chair the safety commission, Be the person who makes sure we don't just fix the immediate problem, but rebuild the entire system so this can never happen again. Caleb stared at her, trying to process what she was offering. It was everything he'd wanted 3 years ago: vindication, authority, the power to actually change things. But it also meant stepping fully back into a world he'd fled, exposing himself and Noah to scrutiny and danger, becoming the public face of the largest corporate scandal in aerospace history. "They'll come after me," he said. "The board members who knew, the executives who profited, the shareholders who'll lose billions. They'll dig into my past, try to discredit my expertise, maybe even threaten my son to keep me quiet. I know. That's why I'm offering you full protection. Security for you and Noah, legal representation, financial support until this is resolved. And more than that, I'm offering you my word that I will stand beside you every step of the way. When they attack you, they attack me. When they try to silence you, they'll have to go through me first." "Why would you do that? You barely know me." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the darkening mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Because when I was drowning in that cockpit, when my lungs were burning and the darkness was closing in, my last thought was that I deserved it. That all the compromises I'd made, all the times I'd chosen the easy path instead of the right one, had led to this moment. And then you were there, breathing life back into me, giving me a second chance I hadn't earned." She turned to face him fully. "I don't believe in fate or divine intervention or any of that. But I do believe that sometimes we're given opportunities to become better than we were. And I'm choosing to believe that you pulling me from that wreck wasn't just random chance. It was the universe giving me the chance to do what my father should have done 3 years ago. To choose people over profit, to choose truth over comfort." That's a hell of a lot of weight to put on one coincidence. "Maybe, but you made your choice when you dove into that lake. Now I'm making mine." She extended her hand. "Will you help me do this right? Will you help me tear down what needs to be torn down and build something better?" Caleb looked at her hand, at the woman who'd gone from his rescuee to his potential ally in the span of a week. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was too risky, too exposed, too likely to end in disaster. But the part of him that had spent 3 years hiding in the mountains, that had watched his wife's casket lowered into the ground, knowing the truth would never see daylight, that part was tired of being careful. He shook her hand. "All right, but we do this completely transparent. No backroom deals, no selective disclosure, no protecting anyone who knew. If we're burning it down, we burn down everyone who lit the match." "Agreed. And Noah's safety is non-negotiable. If at any point I feel like he's in danger, I walk away and you don't try to stop me." "Of course. And when this is over, when we've exposed everything and destroyed the company and ruined the people responsible, I want to guarantee that the fix actually gets implemented. I want to see every G650 in the fleet retrofitted with proper turbine mounting brackets. I want independent verification. I want ironclad assurance that no one else's wife is going to fall out of the sky because of a flaw we could have fixed." "You have my word," Evelyn said. "Whatever it takes." They stood there on the deck as night settled fully over the mountains, two unlikely allies planning the destruction of a corporate empire. Somewhere in the darkness below, Lake Sentinel reflected the first stars of evening, peaceful and unchanging. In 3 days, that peace would shatter when they held their press conference. In 3 days, the carefully constructed lies would begin to crumble. In 3 days, everything would change. But tonight, there was just the mountain air and the weight of decisions made, and the strange, fragile understanding between two people who'd been brought together by tragedy and were choosing to make something meaningful from it. "There's one more thing," Evelyn said, breaking the silence. "I need to show you something, inside." She led him back through the cabin to a home office that looked more like a war room. 3 large monitors displayed what appeared to be security footage from various angles of the lake where her jet had crashed. Papers covered every surface: accident reports, engineering diagrams, timelines marked with red annotations. "I've been trying to understand exactly what happened to my plane," Evelyn said, gesturing to the chaos. "The NTSB preliminary report says catastrophic engine failure, both turbines, just like you predicted. But I wanted to know why now. Why did my aircraft fail when it did, in that specific location?" She pulled up a maintenance log on one of the monitors. Marcus, my pilot, he was religious about maintenance, every inspection, every service interval, by the book. The aircraft had just passed its annual certification 3 weeks ago, so either the inspectors missed something obvious or someone made sure they missed it, Caleb finished, his mind already racing through the implications. You think it was sabotage? I think someone knew that I was starting to ask questions about our safety record. I think someone knew that I'd requested a full audit of our maintenance protocols and engineering reviews. And I think someone decided that a tragic accident would be easier to manage than an investigation by a CEO who'd stopped being cooperative. Caleb moved closer to the monitors, studying the maintenance logs with an engineer's eye. The turbine mounting brackets had been flagged for monitoring but not replacement, standard protocol for Cross Aerospace's quiet management of the flaw. But someone with access to maintenance records and knowledge of the defect could easily identify which aircraft were closest to failure and accelerate the process. The crash happened over your lake, Evelyn continued. Not over open ocean or populated areas or anywhere the wreckage would be difficult to recover. And you just happened to be there. A former Cross Aerospace engineer who tried to expose this exact flaw. If I had died, and you'd been investigated as a potential suspect, it would have been the perfect way to discredit both of us simultaneously. That's paranoid, Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd spent 3 years in these mountains precisely because he knew how far the company would go to protect itself. Is it? Robert found this in the recovered wreckage. Evelyn opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed evidence bag containing what looked like a small electronic device, partially melted. The NTSB hasn't cataloged it yet. Robert pulled it before they finished their dive recovery. It's a GPS tracker, military grade, attached to the exterior of the fuselage. Someone was monitoring my plane's exact location. The implications settled over Caleb like a physical weight. This wasn't just corporate negligence anymore. This was attempted murder dressed up as mechanical failure. This was someone inside Cross Aerospace deciding that killing their own CEO was preferable to letting the truth come out. You need to give that to the NTSB, Caleb said, and the FBI. This is way beyond safety violations. I will. But first I need to figure out who put it there. Because whoever did this is still inside my company, still has access to our aircraft, still has the power to make more accidents happen. Evelyn's expression was grim. That press conference in 3 days? We're not just exposing a cover-up, we're painting a target on both our backs. So what do you want to do? I want to set a trap. She pulled up another file on the monitors, this one showing organizational charts with several names highlighted in red. These are the board members and executives who had access to maintenance schedules, knowledge of the defect, and the authority to order equipment modifications. 12 people. One of them tried to kill me. And you want to flush them out. I want to give them enough rope to hang themselves. The press conference will announce our intention to ground the fleet and issue recalls. But before that, I'm going to send these 12 people a private memo, slightly different versions, each one with a unique identifier embedded in the metadata. If any version gets leaked or if there's another accident in the next 3 days, we'll know exactly who's responsible. Caleb studied the names on the screen. Some he recognized from his time at the company, senior vice presidents, board members, people with decades of institutional power. Any one of them could have authorized his wife's death with a stroke of a pen. Any one of them could have planted that tracker on Evelyn's plane. This is dangerous, he said. If they figure out what you're doing, then we'd better make sure they don't figure it out until it's too late. Evelyn's smile was sharp and cold. I've been playing corporate politics my whole life, Mr. Morgan. I know how to set a trap. The question is whether you're willing to be the bait. I stopped being careful when I pulled you out of that lake. Then we understand each other. They spent the next 2 hours going over the plan in detail, the press conference strategy, the trap for the saboteur, the legal steps that would follow once they went public. By the time Caleb left the cabin, it was past midnight and his mind was spinning with contingencies and possibilities. The drive back down the mountain was treacherous in the dark, his truck's headlights barely cutting through the shadows. He thought about Noah sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that his father was about to drag them both into something far more dangerous than either of them had bargained for. He thought about Emily, about the moment 3 years ago when he'd gotten the call that her plane had gone down. The numbness that had followed, the rage, the crushing guilt that maybe if he'd pushed harder, fought louder, refused to be silenced, she might still be alive. And he thought about Evelyn, standing on her deck overlooking mountains that had watched empires rise and fall, choosing to destroy her own legacy rather than let it continue to be built on lies. Maybe they were both crazy. Maybe this whole plan would blow up in their faces and accomplish nothing except getting them both killed. But at least they were doing something. At least they were choosing action over silence. The cabin was dark when he arrived home, except for a single lamp Mrs. Patterson had left burning in the living room. She emerged from the guest room where she'd been reading, her expression knowing. "He asked about you 3 times before he finally fell asleep," she said softly. "Wanted to know if you were safe." "I'm safe," Caleb assured her, though the words felt like a lie even as he spoke them. "Whatever you're doing, Caleb, I hope it's worth it. That boy has already lost his mother. He can't lose his father, too." "I know." Caleb walked her to the door, thanked her for watching Noah, and stood on his porch watching her taillights disappear down the driveway. The lake was barely visible in the darkness, a pool of deeper shadow surrounded by the silhouettes of mountains. Inside, he checked on Noah, found his son sprawled across the bed in that boneless way children sleep, one arm hanging off the edge, the inhaler on the nightstand where it always sat. Caleb adjusted the blanket, kissed his son's forehead, and allowed himself a moment of fierce, protective love. "I'm going to make it right," he whispered. "For your mom, for everyone. I promise." Then he went to his own room, to his laptop and the encrypted files and the plan that would either bring justice or destroy them all. Sleep seemed impossible, unnecessary even. There was too much to do, too many details to verify, too many ways this could go catastrophically wrong. His phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Second thoughts?" Caleb typed back. "Too late for second thoughts. We're committed now." "Good, because I just sent the trap memos. If someone's going to make a move, it'll be in the next 48 hours. Stay alert. Always." He set the phone down and pulled up the engineering diagrams he'd been working on. Detailed plans for the turbine mounting bracket retrofit, specifications for testing and verification, implementation timelines for a full fleet modification. This was what should have been done 3 years ago. This was what would have saved Emily and 92 other people. Better late than never. Though that phrase felt hollow when applied to the dead. The next morning, Caleb drove Noah to school like it was any other day. He made the same breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, drove the same route, reminded his son about the same things. Don't forget your lunch, be kind to the other kids. If you feel your chest getting tight, use your inhaler immediately. But everything felt different now, charged with the weight of secrets and impending explosions. Caleb found himself checking the rearview mirror more than usual, noting the cars that seemed to follow the same route, the faces of other parents at drop-off that he didn't recognize. "Dad, you're acting weird," Noah said as they pulled up to the school. "Just tired, buddy. Didn't sleep well." "Is it because of the important stuff? The stuff to help people?" Caleb managed a smile. "Yeah, but it's good important stuff. The kind your mom would be proud of." Noah considered this with his usual seriousness, then leaned over and hugged his father tightly. "I'm proud of you too, even if you're being weird about it." After drop-off, Caleb drove to the local coffee shop where he'd arranged to meet Sarah Chen, the NTSB investigator. She was already there, sitting in a back corner booth with 2 laptops and a stack of files that looked distinctly official. "Mr. Morgan," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. You said it was urgent." "It is." Sarah's expression was troubled as she opened one of the laptops and turned it to face him. "I've been analyzing the wreckage from Ms. Cross's crash. The turbine mounting brackets show the exact failure pattern you described in your report from 3 years ago. Stress fractures, accelerated fatigue, catastrophic separation. It's identical to the pattern in 7 other crashes, including your wife's flight." Caleb had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still hit like a physical blow. "So my report was right." "Your report was absolutely right." Which raises a very serious question. Why did Cross Aerospace continue operating these aircraft when they knew about the defect? Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I've been trying to get access to internal company documents, but I'm being blocked at every turn. Legal barriers, jurisdictional issues, sudden classification of materials as proprietary. Someone very powerful doesn't want me seeing what's in those files. What if I told you I could get you those files? Sarah's eyes sharpened. I'd ask how a former employee living in a cabin on a lake has access to classified internal documents. And I'd tell you that Evelyn Cross gave them to me. That she's planning to go public with everything in 2 days, and that she wants to cooperate fully with federal investigators. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah sat back, her expression carefully neutral, but Caleb could see the calculations running behind her eyes. This was either the biggest break in her investigation or the start of an elaborate obstruction scheme. Why would the CEO of Cross Aerospace voluntarily expose her own company to what would likely be the largest wrongful death liability in aviation history? Because she nearly died in a crash that should never have happened. Because she's tired of running a company built on acceptable casualties. And because I convinced her that the only way forward is through the truth. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You understand that if you're lying to me, if this is some kind of scheme to control the narrative or limit the investigation, I will personally see to it that you face federal obstruction charges? I understand, and I'm not lying. Then I need everything. Every memo, every email, every piece of evidence that shows who knew what and when. I need proof of the cover-up, documentation of the decision to keep operating defective aircraft, evidence of any attempts to suppress safety concerns. You'll have it, but I need something from you in return. Caleb pulled out his phone and showed her the photo Evelyn had shared, the GPS tracker recovered from the wreckage. We think someone inside Cross Aerospace tried to assassinate Evelyn. We need to know if this device can be traced back to whoever planted it. Sarah's expression darkened as she examined the photo. If this is what I think it is, this investigation just became a potential homicide case. I'll need the physical evidence immediately. You'll get it at the press conference in 2 days, along with everything else. They spent the next hour going over details, with Caleb providing enough information to convince Sarah that this was legitimate while holding back enough to ensure the press conference would still have impact. By the time he left the coffee shop, he could see the change in her demeanor. The investigator's hunger for truth that had been frustrated by bureaucratic barriers was now laser-focused on bringing down the people responsible. One ally secured. But how many enemies had they just activated? The answer came sooner than Caleb expected. He was halfway home when his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize but with a local area code. Mr. Morgan, this is Principal Watkins from Mountain View Elementary. I'm afraid there's been an incident with Noah. Caleb's blood turned to ice. What kind of incident? He had an asthma attack during recess, a severe one. The school nurse administered his rescue inhaler, but he's not responding as well as we'd hoped. We've called an ambulance. They're taking him to Mountain View Medical Center. The rest of the conversation was a blur. Caleb was already turning the truck around, already calculating routes and times, already reaching for his phone to call Evelyn because her private number had direct access to the hospital's emergency services, and that thought stopped him cold. Noah's asthma was usually well controlled. He'd been fine this morning, showed no signs of respiratory distress. For him to have a severe attack out of nowhere, at school, right after Caleb had met with the NTSB investigator. Coincidence? Or a message? He called Evelyn anyway, his hands shaking as he fought to keep the truck on the winding mountain road. She answered on the first ring. Caleb? What's wrong? Noah's having a severe asthma attack. They're taking him to Mountain View Medical. I'm 20 minutes out, but I need you to call ahead. Make sure they're ready. Make sure they have everything. I'm on it. I'll meet you there. Evelyn, wait. What if this isn't an accident? What if someone is sending us a message? The silence on the other end was heavy with implication. I'll bring security. And Caleb, drive fast but don't crash. Your son needs you alive. The 20-minute drive took 14, with Caleb pushing the old truck faster than he should have, through curves that punished mistakes with fatal drops. His mind kept cycling through worst-case scenarios, each one more terrible than the last. Noah struggling to breathe. Noah unconscious. Noah gone. Another victim of the machine Caleb was trying to dismantle. He nearly crashed through the emergency room doors, his eyes wild as he scanned for his son. A nurse intercepted him, her voice calm and professional. Mr. Morgan? Your son is stable. We've got him on continuous nebulizer treatment and he's responding well. You can see him, but please try to stay calm. He needs to keep his breathing steady. The relief nearly knocked Caleb's legs out from under him. He followed the nurse to a curtained bay where Noah sat propped up on a hospital bed, an oxygen mask over his small face, his eyes wide and frightened but alive, breathing, safe. "Dad?" Noah wheezed through the mask. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here." Caleb took his son's hand, feeling the small fingers grip his with desperate strength. "You're going to be okay. The medicine is working." "Couldn't breathe. Was scary." "I know, but you're safe now. You did the right thing telling your teacher." A doctor appeared, a young woman with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who'd seen too many emergency cases. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Dr. Patel. Your son had a severe bronchospasm, likely triggered by cold air exposure during outdoor recess. We've stabilized him, but I want to keep him for observation for a few hours to make sure he doesn't have a rebound episode." "Was it just the cold air?" Caleb asked, searching her face for any sign that she suspected something else. "There's nothing unusual about the attack?" Dr. Patel's expression shifted slightly, became more guarded. "Why do you ask?" "Because my son's asthma is usually very well controlled, and the timing of this, right after—" He caught himself, aware that Noah was listening. The paranoia could be just as dangerous as actual threats. "I'm just worried. Want to make sure we're not missing anything." We ran a full panel. No sign of allergens, toxins, or foreign substances. Sometimes asthma is just unpredictable, especially in children. But she handed him her card anyway, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood there might be more to the story than respiratory illness. "Call me directly if you have any concerns." Evelyn arrived 15 minutes later, sweeping into the emergency room with Robert Kane and another security guard Caleb didn't recognize. She took in the scene, Noah stable but frightened, Caleb hovering protectively, the obvious tension in the air, and made a decision. "Robert, I want security on this room. No one in or out except medical staff, and I want their credentials verified. And get me the school's security footage from this morning. All of it." "Ms. Cross, that might be overreacting." "Do it." Her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who'd just realized the stakes were higher than she'd calculated. "And run a background check on everyone who had contact with Noah today. Teachers, staff, other parents. If someone got to him, I want to know how." Kane left to make the arrangements, and Evelyn approached Noah's bedside. Her expression softened as she looked at the small boy with the oxygen mask, and something in her face reminded Caleb that she'd almost died less than a week ago, that she understood fragility and fear. "Hey there," she said gently to Noah. "My name is Evelyn. Your dad saved my life a few days ago." Noah's eyes widened above the mask. "You're the lady from the plane?" "That's me. Your dad is pretty brave." "He's the bravest." Noah's voice was muffled but certain. "He's going to help people so what happened to my mom doesn't happen to anyone else." Evelyn glanced at Caleb, and something passed between them, a shared understanding of what they were risking, what they stood to lose, and why they had to see it through anyway. "He is," she agreed, "and I'm going to help him. But first, we're going to make sure you're completely better. Deal?" Noah nodded, already looking tired from the medication and the stress. Caleb adjusted his son's blanket, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. If this was a message, it was effective. If this was a warning shot, he'd heard it loud and clear. Touch my son and all bets were off. But first, he had to get through the next 2 days. Had to survive until the press conference, until the truth came out, until the people responsible faced consequences for what they'd done. And he had to keep Noah safe, whatever it took. Noah fell asleep an hour later, the medication and exhaustion finally overcoming the fear that had kept him alert. Caleb sat beside the hospital bed, watching his son's chest rise and fall with a rhythm that was blessedly steady, and tried not to think about how close they'd come to losing that rhythm entirely. Evelyn stood by the window, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in low, clipped tones that carried the weight of someone issuing orders that would be obeyed without question. When she finally ended the call, her expression was grim. "The school's security footage shows nothing unusual," she said quietly. "No unauthorized access to Noah's classroom or his belongings. No tampering with his inhaler. The nurse confirmed that the rescue medication she administered came from the school's locked supply, not from Noah's personal inhaler." "So it was just an asthma attack," Caleb said, but his voice carried doubt. Or whoever did this was careful enough not to leave evidence. Evelyn crossed to stand beside him, her eyes on Noah's sleeping form. Robert found something else, though. The GPS tracker on my plane, it was purchased through a shell company that traces back to a private security firm that does contract work for Cross Aerospace. Specifically, they handle sensitive situations that require discretion. The implications settled over Caleb like a heavy blanket. Corporate-sanctioned assassination. Looks that way. And if they were willing to take out their own CEO, a 7-year-old child wouldn't even register as a moral boundary. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. I've authorized round-the-clock protection for both of you. Robert and his team will shadow you everywhere until this is over. That's going to scare Noah more than help him. Then we'll be discreet. But I'm not taking any more chances. Not with his life. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. He looks like his mother, doesn't he? Around the eyes. Ah, Caleb felt something twist in his chest. Yeah, he does. I'm sorry for what my company took from you, from him, for what my father chose to value over human lives. The words were simple but carried a weight of genuine remorse. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Before Caleb could respond, his phone buzzed with an alert. He checked it and felt his blood run cold. Someone had sent him a video file from an anonymous email address. The subject line read simply, "Stop asking questions." He opened it with trembling fingers, already knowing it would be bad. The video showed security footage from outside Noah's school, time-stamped from this morning, showing children arriving for class. The camera zoomed in on Noah getting out of Caleb's truck, then a red circle appeared around his small figure, tracking him as he walked toward the building. A targeting reticle, digital and precise. The message was clear. We can reach him anytime we want. Caleb's vision went red at the edges. Evelyn took the phone from his shaking hands, watched the video, and her face went pale with fury. Forward this to me, now! Her voice was ice. And then we're moving up the press conference. What? We're not waiting 2 more days for them to make another move. We go public tomorrow. Full disclosure, all the evidence, everything. The only way to protect Noah is to make this so public that killing either of you would be suicide for whoever's behind this. That doesn't give us time to... I don't care about time. I care about keeping that child safe. Evelyn was already dialing her phone again. Robert, I need a secure location for a press conference tomorrow morning. Major media presence, federal investigators, the whole circus. And I want Noah Morgan moved to a safe house tonight with full security detail. Ms. Cross, if we rush this, then we rush it. Make it happen. She ended the call and looked at Caleb with an intensity that bordered on fierce. I know this isn't how we planned it. I know we're giving up strategic advantage by acting this quickly. But your son just became collateral damage in a war he didn't sign up for, and I won't let that stand. Caleb looked at Noah sleeping peacefully, unaware of the targeting video, or the threats, or the fact that powerful people viewed his life as acceptable losses in their effort to bury the truth. He thought about Emily, about how she'd died trusting that the systems meant to keep her safe would actually work, about how that trust had been betrayed by men in boardrooms who'd calculated that her life was worth less than their quarterly earnings. Okay, he said, his voice rough with emotion and determination. We do it tomorrow. But I want Noah somewhere those bastards can't touch him. Somewhere with more than just security guards. I know a place. Evelyn pulled up something on her phone and showed him. A private facility in the mountains used by federal witnesses in protective custody, military-grade security, medical staff on site completely off the grid. Noah can stay there with Mrs. Patterson until this is finished. He's going to be terrified. He's going to be alive. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. And I'll make sure he understands that his father is a hero, that what you're doing matters, that sometimes being brave means being scared and doing it anyway. Dr. Patel returned before Caleb could respond, her professional smile not quite hiding the concern in her eyes. Noah's vitals are stable and his breathing has returned to normal. I'm comfortable discharging him, but I want to see him back in a week for a follow-up. And Mr. Morgan, if anything like this happens again, bring him straight to the ER. Don't wait. I will. Thank you. They woke Noah gently, and the boy's confusion at seeing both his father and the lady from the plane crash made Caleb's heart ache. He wanted to explain everything, wanted to make his son understand why their life was about to change dramatically. But 7-year-olds shouldn't have to understand corporate conspiracies and assassination attempts. "Hey, buddy," Caleb said, helping Noah sit up. "How are you feeling?" "Better. My chest doesn't hurt anymore." Noah looked between his father and Evelyn with that particular child's instinct for sensing when adults were hiding something. "Are we in trouble?" "No, but we're going to go on a little adventure for a few days. You and Mrs. Patterson are going to stay in a really cool place in the mountains while Dad takes care of some important work." "Without you?" The fear in Noah's voice nearly broke Caleb's resolve. "Just for a few days. And then I'll come get you and we'll go home and everything will be better, I promise." "You said promises are sacred." "They are. And I keep my promises, don't I?" Noah nodded slowly, but his small hand gripped Caleb's with desperate strength. "Is this because of the important stuff? The stuff to help people?" "Yeah, it's almost done. Just a little bit longer and then we can go back to normal." Except normal was gone. Normal had disappeared the moment Caleb had pulled Evelyn from that sinking jet. Normal had been an illusion anyway, a thin veneer over 3 years of hiding and grief and unfinished business. Maybe it was time to stop pretending normal was something they could get back to. The transport to the safe house happened with military efficiency. Robert Kane arranged for a convoy of 3 vehicles, one carrying Caleb and Noah, one with Evelyn and her security team, and one filled with federal marshals who'd been loaned to them by Sarah Chen after she'd seen the targeting video. They left through the hospital's underground parking garage and took a route that wound through back roads and highway exits designed to shake any surveillance. Mrs. Patterson met them at the safe house, her weathered face set with determination. She took one look at Noah's frightened expression and immediately gathered him into her arms with grandmotherly efficiency. "Well now," she said, "this looks like quite the fancy place they've got us staying at. I bet they have hot chocolate and maybe even some cookies. What do you say we go exploring while your dad talks to these folks?" Noah looked back at Caleb one more time, his eyes pleading for reassurance that this was all going to be okay. Caleb knelt down and pulled his son into a fierce hug. "I love you more than anything in this world," he whispered, "and I'm going to come back for you, I promise." "Sacred promise?" "Sacred promise." Noah nodded against his father's shoulder, then let Mrs. Patterson lead him deeper into the facility. Caleb watched them go, feeling like his heart was being physically removed from his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to grab his son and run, to disappear into the mountains and never look back. But running had gotten them nowhere. Running had left the people responsible for Emily's death free to kill more people, to nearly kill Evelyn, to threaten his son. "He'll be safe here," Robert Kane said, his gruff voice carrying an unexpected note of kindness. "I've worked witness protection cases before. This facility is as secure as they come." "It better be," Caleb said, his voice hard. "Because if anything happens to him, there isn't a hole deep enough for whoever's responsible to hide in." Kane nodded, understanding passing between them, not quite trust, but a shared commitment to keeping an innocent child safe from the monsters they were about to expose. The drive back to civilization took 2 hours, with Caleb and Evelyn sitting in tense silence in the back of the SUV. Finally, Evelyn broke it. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay." "When you pulled me from that plane, did you know who I was?" The question caught Caleb off guard. "No. I just saw someone who needed help." "But if you had known, if you'd recognized me as the CEO of the company that killed your wife, would you still have saved me?" Caleb thought about it, really thought about it, played through the scenario in his mind, seeing Evelyn's face, recognizing her from news articles and shareholder reports, knowing in that split second that she represented everything he'd lost. Would he have let her drown? "I don't know," he admitted. "I'd like to think I would have done the same thing. But honestly, I don't know if I'm that good of a person." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for being honest." "What about you? If you'd known who I was when you woke up on that shore, a disgraced engineer with a vendetta against your company, would you have still wanted to meet me?" Would you have trusted me with those files? Probably not, Evelyn said. I would have assumed you were trying to exploit the situation for personal gain, would have let my lawyers handle you and moved on. She turned to look at him directly. We're both learning to be better than we were, I think. The universe gave us both second chances we didn't deserve, and we're trying not to waste them. Pretty philosophical for someone who almost died last week. Almost dying tends to clarify one's priorities. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Though I could do without the assassination attempts and child endangerment. They spent the rest of the drive preparing for the press conference, going over talking points, anticipating questions, coordinating with Sarah Chen and the NTSB on evidence presentation. By the time they reached Evelyn's mountain cabin, where they'd planned to spend the night preparing, it was past midnight and both of them were running on coffee and adrenaline. The cabin felt different this time, less like a luxury retreat and more like a war room. Maps and timelines covered every surface. Legal documents were stacked in precarious piles. Laptops glowed with evidence files and testimony transcripts. This was where they'd make their final preparations before stepping in front of cameras and destroying a corporate empire. Robert Kane had arranged for additional security with armed guards positioned at every entrance and exit. It should have felt safe, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, that somewhere in the darkness, someone was making their own preparations. I've been thinking about your question, Evelyn said, pouring them both coffee from a pot that was probably their fourth of the day. About whether I would have trusted you if I'd known who you were. And I think the reason I'm doing this, the reason I'm willing to destroy my own company, isn't actually because you convinced me or because I had some moral epiphany. It's because when I was drowning in that cockpit, I had time to think about who I'd become, about all the compromises I'd made, all the times I'd chosen convenience over conscience. She sat down across from him, her gray eyes reflecting exhaustion and determination. I knew something was wrong with the company. I knew our safety record was declining. I knew there were whispers among the engineering staff about problems being buried. But I told myself it was growing pains, that every aerospace company dealt with this, that my father had built something too strong to be fundamentally broken. You were lying to yourself. I was protecting myself. From the truth, from responsibility, from having to make hard choices. Evelyn wrapped her hands around her coffee mug like it could provide comfort as well as warmth. When you handed me those files, when I saw the actual evidence of what my father had authorized, what my company had done, part of me wanted to bury it again, to find some way to make it go away quietly, to protect the legacy and the shareholders and all the things I'd been taught mattered most. But you didn't. Because you were sitting there in that hospital room looking at me like I was the enemy, like I personally killed your wife. And I realized that's exactly what I was. Maybe not directly, maybe not with my own hands, but by choosing to run a company without really looking at what it was doing, I'd become complicit in every death those defective aircraft caused. She took a sip of coffee, her hand steady despite the weight of what she was saying. So no, I don't think I would have trusted you if I'd known who you were. But I think I needed you to be who you are, someone who couldn't let me hide from the truth, so I could become someone who deserves the second chance you gave me. Caleb absorbed this, understanding for the first time that Evelyn wasn't just an ally in his quest for justice. She was someone fighting her own battle for redemption, trying to atone for sins of omission and willful blindness. They were both damaged people trying to do something right from the wreckage of their mistakes. My wife would have liked you, he said quietly. Emily was always better at seeing the good in people than I was. She would have said that anyone willing to burn down their own empire for the sake of truth deserves respect. What was she like, Emily? Caleb was surprised by the question, and even more surprised that he wanted to answer it. He'd spent 3 years avoiding talking about his wife, as if putting her memory into words would somehow make her absence more real. But sitting here in the darkness before the storm they were about to unleash, it felt right to remember her. She was a teacher, 2nd grade, used to come home with paint in her hair and stories about kids who said the most wonderfully weird things. The memories came easier than he'd expected, less painful than they'd been. She was the one who convinced me to file that safety report. I wanted to just quit, to walk away and let someone else deal with it. But Emily said that if I had knowledge that could save lives and I stayed silent, I'd never forgive myself. She was right about that, like she was right about most things. She sounds remarkable. She was. And she trusted that the system would work, that truth would matter, that people in power would do the right thing when confronted with evidence. Caleb's voice hardened. She died believing that her flight was safe, that the aircraft had been properly maintained, that the company making billions off those planes wouldn't cut corners on something as fundamental as engine mounts. She died trusting a system that failed her. We're going to make sure it doesn't fail anyone else. Tomorrow, Caleb agreed. Tomorrow we burn it all down. They worked through the night, refining their presentation, preparing for every question they could anticipate and some they couldn't. Sarah Chen sent over the official NTSB preliminary findings: catastrophic turbine mounting bracket failure in Evelyn's crash, with strong evidence suggesting similar failures in 7 previous incidents. The pattern was undeniable, the cover-up transparent once you knew what to look for. Around 4 in the morning, Caleb's phone rang. The number showed as the safe house where Noah was staying, and his heart immediately lurched into his throat. "Noah, what's wrong?" "Dad, I can't sleep." His son's voice was small and frightened. "I keep having the dream about Mom's plane, the one where it's falling and I can't stop it." Caleb closed his eyes, fighting against the wave of guilt and grief. "I know, buddy, but remember what we talked about? Sometimes our brains show us scary things when we're worried, but it doesn't mean they're real." "Is what you're doing dangerous?" The question was too perceptive for a 7-year-old and too important to answer with a lie. "A little bit. But I'm being very careful, and I have people protecting me." "Like the lady from the plane?" "Yeah, like Evelyn. She's helping me make things safer so what happened to Mom doesn't happen to other kids' moms." There was a long pause, and Caleb could hear Noah thinking, processing. "That's good. Mom would want that." "She would. Now try to get some sleep, okay? I'll call you tomorrow after my important meeting." "Okay, Dad, I love you." "I love you too, buddy. More than anything in the world." After he hung up, Caleb found Evelyn watching him with an expression that was difficult to read. "He's a good kid," she said. "You're raising him right." "I'm doing the best I can. Some days I feel like I'm failing him completely." "You dove into freezing water to save a stranger's life while your son watched from the shore. You're teaching him that courage matters, that doing the right thing is worth the risk. That's not failing." Before Caleb could respond, Robert Kane burst through the door, his phone pressed to his ear and his face tight with tension. "We've got a problem. One of the board members, Gregory Mathers, just got on a private flight to the Cayman Islands. 30 minutes ago, he liquidated his entire stock portfolio and transferred the funds offshore." Evelyn was on her feet instantly. "He's running, which means he knows we're about to go public." "More than that," Kane continued. 15 minutes ago, our trap memo with his unique identifier was anonymously forwarded to 3 major news outlets and the FAA. He's trying to get ahead of the story, spin himself as the whistleblower who exposed the cover-up." "That son of a bitch," Evelyn breathed. "He was the one who tried to kill me?" "Looks that way. He had access to maintenance schedules, approved the contract with the security firm that planted the tracker, and his assistant's computer shows deleted emails coordinating the timing of your flight with areas of known turbine bracket weakness." Kane's expression was grim. He was planning to let you die, take over as CEO, and quietly settle any lawsuits while maintaining the cover-up. Our investigation forced his hand. Caleb felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. They had their culprit, had evidence of the conspiracy, had proof that this went beyond negligence into active malice, but they'd also just lost their element of surprise. "We move now," he said. "Call the press conference for 6 a.m. Get every news outlet you can reach. We go public before Mathers can control the narrative." "That's in 2 hours," Kane protested. "We won't have time to—" "Then we improvise. But we're not letting him get away with this." Caleb looked at Evelyn. "You with me?" She smiled, and there was something fierce and beautiful in her expression. "All the way to the ashes." The next 2 hours were chaos. Phone calls to journalists and federal investigators, frantic preparations of evidence packets, coordination with the NTSB and FAA on timing releases to avoid market panic. By the time the sun started to rise over the mountains, they had assembled what amounted to the largest press conference in aerospace history. The venue was a hotel ballroom in Denver, hastily arranged and already packed with cameras and reporters by the time Caleb and Evelyn arrived. Federal marshals provided security, keeping the crowd at a controlled distance while they set up at the podium. Behind them, screens displayed the evidence they were about to present: engineering diagrams, accident reports, internal memos that proved the cover-up. Sarah Chen was there, her NTSB credentials giving official weight to their claims. The FBI had sent representatives after Kane had provided them with evidence of the assassination attempt. And sitting in the front row, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, were 3 other Cross Aerospace board members who'd been subpoenaed by federal investigators overnight. Caleb stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of cameras and reporters and federal officials, and felt the weight of 3 years of silence finally lifting. Somewhere in a safe house in the mountains, Noah was probably just waking up, unaware that his father was about to change both their lives forever. Somewhere in the Cayman Islands, Gregory Mathers was probably congratulating himself on his escape, unaware that his betrayal had been documented in exhaustive detail. And somewhere in a cemetery plot overlooking a valley, Emily Morgan rested beneath a headstone that read, "Beloved wife and mother," finally about to receive the justice she deserved. Evelyn stepped to the microphone first, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. "Good morning. My name is Evelyn Cross, CEO of Cross Aerospace. 5 days ago, I was pulled from a crashed aircraft by a man I'd never met, a former employee of my company who had tried to warn us about the exact mechanical failure that nearly killed me. Today, I'm here to tell you that he was right, that my company has been operating defective aircraft for years, that we've covered up crashes that killed hundreds of people, and that at least one member of our board of directors attempted to murder me to prevent this truth from coming out." The room erupted in shouted questions, but Evelyn raised her hand for silence. "You'll get all your answers, but first I want you to hear from the man who saved my life. The man who's been trying to expose this corruption for 3 years. The man who lost his wife because we valued profit over safety. Caleb Morgan." Caleb stepped to the microphone, his hands gripping the podium to keep them from shaking. He looked out at the cameras, knowing that Noah would see this eventually, knowing that Emily's family would see it, knowing that the families of every victim would see it, and finally understand that someone had been fighting for them. 3 years ago, he began, his voice rough but growing stronger with each word, I filed a safety report warning that Cross Aerospace's G650 aircraft had a fundamental design flaw in their turbine mounting brackets. I provided engineering analysis showing that stress fractures would develop over time, that catastrophic failure was inevitable, that people would die unless the fleet was grounded and retrofitted. My report was buried. I was forced out of the company, and 3 months later my wife died when her plane fell out of the sky because of the exact failure I'd warned about. He paused, letting that sink in. 93 people died on that flight, and over the next 3 years, hundreds more died in crashes that displayed the same failure pattern. All of those deaths were preventable. All of those lives could have been saved if Cross Aerospace had chosen to act on my warnings instead of protecting their profit margins. Caleb pulled out a document and held it up to the cameras. This is the internal memo from James Cross, Evelyn's father and the former CEO, authorizing the burial of my safety report. It includes a cost-benefit analysis showing that settling wrongful death lawsuits would be cheaper than retrofitting the fleet. It puts a dollar value on human life and decides that value isn't worth the expense of doing the right thing. The room had gone silent except for the mechanical whir of cameras. Caleb could see tears on some faces, rage on others. This was it, the moment of truth that would either bring justice or destroy everything he'd worked for. But this isn't just about one corrupt CEO or one defective aircraft, he continued. This is about a system that allows companies to prioritize profit over safety, to bury evidence of wrongdoing, to silence whistleblowers who try to do the right thing. Today, we're tearing down that system. Today, the truth comes out, and everyone responsible will face consequences. He stepped back and let Evelyn take over, let her detail the evidence they'd compiled, the timeline of the cover-up, the identification of Gregory Mathers as the board member who'd orchestrated the assassination attempt. Sarah Chen presented the NTSB findings. FBI representatives announced their investigation into corporate homicide and conspiracy charges. And through it all, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, Not quite peace, not yet, but something close to it. The weight of secrets and silence was finally lifting, replaced by the bright, terrible clarity of truth exposed to daylight. The press conference lasted 3 hours. By the time it ended, Cross Aerospace's stock had been suspended from trading pending investigation. Federal authorities had issued arrest warrants for 6 executives, including Gregory Mathers. Airlines around the world had begun grounding their G650 fleets. And Caleb Morgan, reclusive engineer and single father, had become the face of the largest corporate accountability case in aviation history. They left through a back exit, avoiding the scrum of reporters trying to get follow-up quotes. Robert Kane hustled them into an armored SUV and they pulled away from the hotel with an escort of federal marshals. Caleb's phone was exploding with messages from journalists, from lawyers, from Emily's family thanking him through tears, from other engineers who'd been silenced by Cross Aerospace and were now ready to come forward. But the only message he cared about was the one from Mrs. Patterson. Noah saw you on TV. He says you were brave. He's proud of you. Caleb closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 years. Noah was safe. The truth was out. And while there was still so much to do, investigations to cooperate with, lawsuits to face, a company to dismantle and rebuild, at least they'd taken the first step. Where do we go from here, Les? He asked Evelyn, who was staring out the window at the city passing by with an expression of exhausted relief. For me? Federal depositions, shareholder lawsuits, probably criminal charges for my role in continuing operations after I took over as CEO. She turned to look at him. I'm going to pay for what my company did. That's only right. And after that? After that? She smiled, and it was the first genuinely peaceful expression Caleb had seen on her face. After that, I'm going to help you build that safety foundation. Make sure the retrofit actually happens. Create systems to protect whistleblowers and punish executives who put profit over lives. Turn the wreckage of Cross Aerospace into something that actually serves the people who fly instead of the people who profit. That's going to take years. Good thing we both just blew up our previous career plans. Evelyn's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, her expression tightening. Gregory Mathers just landed in Grand Cayman, but the FBI has already coordinated with local authorities. He'll be in custody within the hour. Will it stick, the charges? With the evidence we provided, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, along with everyone else who knew about the cover-up and chose to stay silent. She reached over and squeezed Caleb's hand, brief and almost awkward, but genuine. We did it. We actually did it. Caleb thought about Emily, about how she'd believe truth would matter if only someone was brave enough to tell it. About Noah watching his father on television, learning that sometimes the right thing was hard and scary and cost everything you had, but was still worth doing. About all the people who would fly safely now because 2 unlikely allies had chosen conscience over convenience. Yeah, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We did. The SUV wound through Denver traffic, heading back toward the mountains and the safe house where Noah waited. Behind them, the world was already changing, stocks tumbling, investigations launching, careers ending, and perhaps most importantly, aircraft being grounded until they could be fixed properly. The deaths would stop. The lies would end. And out of the ashes of Cross Aerospace's corruption, something better might eventually grow. But first, Caleb had a promise to keep. A sacred promise to a 7-year-old boy who'd been brave while his father fought battles that should never have been necessary. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Mrs. Patterson. Coming to get him. Be there in 3 hours. Evelyn was already on her laptop, coordinating with lawyers and federal investigators and the engineering teams that would handle the retrofit. The work was just beginning, the consequences were still unfolding, and there would be difficult days ahead. But for the first time since that morning, by the lake when a jet had fallen from the sky, Caleb felt like they were moving in the right direction. Not toward revenge, but toward justice. Not toward covering up the past, but toward building a better future. And maybe, just maybe, toward the kind of peace that came from knowing you'd done everything you could to make sure the tragedies you'd lived through would never happen to anyone else. The mountains rose ahead of them, patient and unchanging. Somewhere in their shadows, Noah was waiting. And beyond tomorrow's headlines and investigations and trials, There would eventually be a day when father and son could return to their cabin by the lake and try to build something resembling normal again. But this time, normal would be built on truth instead of silence. And that made all the difference. The safe house came into view just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the western peaks, painting the mountainside in shades of amber and gold. Caleb was out of the SUV before it had fully stopped, his legs carrying him toward the entrance with a desperate urgency that had built during every mile of the 3-hour drive. He needed to see Noah, needed to hold his son and prove to himself that the boy was safe, that the gamble they'd taken hadn't cost him the only family he had left. Mrs. Patterson met him at the door, her weathered face creased with a smile that held both relief and concern. He's in the recreation room, been glued to the television most of the day watching the news coverage. Asked me about 100 questions I didn't know how to answer. Is he okay? Physically, yes. His breathing's been fine, no sign of another attack. But emotionally? She shook her head. That's a conversation you need to have with him, not me. Caleb found Noah sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of a large television, his small body rigid with attention as a news anchor discussed the latest developments in what they were calling the Cross Aerospace scandal. On screen, footage from the press conference played on a loop. Caleb at the podium, his face set with determination, speaking words that were already being quoted by every major outlet in the world. "Hey, buddy," Caleb said softly. Noah's head whipped around, and for a moment his young face showed a confusion of emotions. Relief, fear, pride, and something that looked almost like awe. Then he was up and running, throwing himself into his father's arms with enough force to nearly knock Caleb backward. "You were on TV," Noah said, his voice muffled against Caleb's chest. "Everyone was talking about you. They said you're a hero." "I'm just someone who told the truth. They said Mom's plane crashed because bad people knew it wasn't safe and didn't fix it. Is that true?" Caleb closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that question settle over him. He'd known this conversation would come eventually, had rehearsed different versions of it in his head over the years. But sitting here with his son in his arms, the truth raw and exposed to the world, all his careful explanations seemed inadequate. "Yes," he said finally, "that's true." "And you tried to tell them before Mom died? You tried to stop it?" "I did. But they didn't listen, and I've been trying to make them listen ever since." Noah pulled back to look at his father's face, his eyes, Emily's eyes, searching for something. "The lady on TV said hundreds of people died, that Mom was just one of them." "She was, and that's why this was so important. So no other kids lose their moms the way you lost yours." "Did you fix it? Did you make them stop the bad planes?" The simplicity of the question, the absolute faith that his father could fix anything, nearly broke Caleb's heart. "Yeah, buddy, we fixed it. All the planes like Mom's are being grounded until they can be made safe. No one else is going to die because of them." Noah nodded slowly, processing this with the serious expression he'd worn too often for a 7-year-old. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "Are the bad people going to try to hurt us again?" Caleb's protective instincts flared immediately. "What makes you ask that?" "I heard Mrs. Patterson talking to the security man. She said we might need to stay here longer because there are still dangerous people who don't want you to tell the truth." Noah's small hands gripped Caleb's shirt. "I don't want them to hurt you like they hurt Mom." "They're not going to hurt me. And they're definitely not going to hurt you. I've got people protecting us now, good people who are making sure we're safe." "Like Evelyn?" The fact that Noah remembered her name, had connected the woman from the plane crash to the person now helping them, showed a perceptiveness that was both impressive and concerning. "Yes, like Evelyn. She's helping make sure all the bad people face consequences for what they did." "Can I meet her? Like, really meet her? Not just when I was in the hospital?" Before Caleb could answer, Evelyn's voice came from the doorway. "I'd like that very much, if your dad says it's okay." Noah turned in Caleb's arms to look at her, his expression shy, but curious. Evelyn had changed from her press conference attire into jeans and a simple sweater, looking more approachable and less like the CEO who'd just dismantled her own corporate empire. She crossed the room slowly, giving Noah space to adjust to her presence. "Hi, Noah. I'm Evelyn. Your dad saved my life." "I know. I saw the plane crash from our dock. It was scary." I bet it was. Your dad is very brave. Not many people would have done what he did. Noah considered this, then looked up at his father. Dad says you're helping make sure the bad people get in trouble. That's right. And I'm also helping make sure you and your dad stay safe while that happens. Are you going to get in trouble too? The question was innocent but perceptive. The lady on TV said you were the boss of the company that made the bad planes. Evelyn's expression flickered. Pain, regret, acceptance. She knelt down so she was at Noah's eye level. I'm going to get in trouble. Because even though I didn't know about the bad planes at first, once I became the boss, I should have looked harder, asked more questions, made sure we were doing the right thing. And I didn't. So yes, I'm going to face consequences for that. But you're helping now. I am, because your dad showed me that it's never too late to do the right thing, even if it's hard and scary and costs you everything you thought mattered. Noah nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer in the way children sometimes are when adults speak to them with honest directness. Then he surprised both of them by asking, "Do you miss your plane? Dad said it sank in our lake and can't be fixed." "I don't miss the plane," Evelyn said softly, "but I miss my pilot, Marcus. He died in the crash, and he was a good person who didn't deserve what happened to him, just like your mom didn't deserve what happened to her. Dad says Mom is watching us from heaven, and she's proud of what we're doing." Caleb felt his throat tighten. He'd said that to Noah in the days after Emily's death, trying to provide comfort in language his 4-year-old son could understand. He'd never been entirely sure he believed it himself, but Noah had held on to those words like a lifeline. "I think she would be proud," Evelyn agreed. "I think she'd be proud of both of you." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway with the timing of someone who'd been waiting for an appropriate break in the conversation. "Dinner's ready when you folks are. Nothing fancy, just chicken and vegetables, but it's hot, and there's plenty." They ate together in the safe house's kitchen, an unexpectedly domestic scene given the chaos surrounding them. Noah chattered between bites about the books Mrs. Patterson had been reading to him and the games the security guards had taught him. The normalcy of it, the simple act of sharing a meal, felt surreal after the intensity of the press conference and the revelations that had followed. Caleb's phone buzzed constantly throughout dinner with updates from lawyers, investigators, and journalists, but he ignored it. This moment with his son felt sacred, a brief island of peace before they had to face whatever came next. Evelyn seemed to understand, keeping her own phone silent and engaging with Noah's stories with genuine interest rather than the polite tolerance adults often showed children. After dinner, Mrs. Patterson ushered Noah off for his evening routine: bath, teeth brushing, the comforting rituals of childhood that remained constant, even as the world around them transformed. Caleb and Evelyn retreated to the safe house's living room, where Robert Kane was waiting with a tablet full of updates. "Gregory Mathers is in federal custody in Miami," Kane reported. "The Cayman Islands cooperation happened faster than expected. He's being extradited tomorrow and will face charges including attempted murder, conspiracy, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice." "What's he saying?" Evelyn asked. "That he was protecting the company from a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. That Caleb's safety report was professionally discredited, and that continuing operations was a sound business decision. That your father authorized everything and he was just following orders." "In other words, he's lying through his teeth," Caleb said. "The evidence contradicts every claim he's making. But he's hired a team of lawyers who'll tie this up in court for years if they can." Kane pulled up more data on his tablet. "The other board members are starting to turn on each other. 3 have hired separate counsel and are negotiating plea deals in exchange for testimony. The FBI thinks they can build a case that traces the conspiracy all the way back to your father, Ms. Cross." Evelyn's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Good. He needs to face consequences too, even if he's retired, especially because he set all of this in motion." "There's more," Kane continued. "The Justice Department has opened a broader investigation into the FAA's oversight failures. How Cross Aerospace was able to continue operations despite repeated safety incidents. There are suggestions of regulatory capture, possibly bribery. This is going to be bigger than just your company." "How much bigger?" Caleb asked. "Congressional hearings bigger, sweeping regulatory reform bigger, complete restructuring of aerospace safety protocols bigger." Kane's expression was grim. You two didn't just expose one company's corruption. You've blown open systemic failures across the entire industry. The weight of that settled over them. What had started as Caleb's personal quest for justice for his wife had metastasized into something far larger, a reckoning for an entire industry that had prioritized profits over safety for too long. It was both more than he'd hoped for and more terrifying than he'd imagined. "What about Noah's safety?" Caleb asked, bringing the focus back to what mattered most. "With this getting bigger, with more people potentially implicated, are we secure here?" "For now, but I'd recommend keeping him here for at least another week while we assess the threat level. Some of the people being implicated have serious resources and fewer scruples than Mathers." Kane stood, closing his tablet. "I've got a team monitoring communications, watching for any indication of retaliation. If anything changes, you'll know immediately." After Kane left, Caleb and Evelyn sat in silence for a long moment. Through the walls, they could hear Noah's laughter as Mrs. Patterson read him a bedtime story, the sound achingly normal against the backdrop of corporate scandals and federal investigations. "I keep thinking about what you asked me," Evelyn said finally, "about whether I would have saved you if I'd known who you were when I was drowning. You said probably not. I've been reconsidering that answer. I think maybe I would have, not because I'm a particularly good person, but because in that moment when I thought I was dying, when the water was filling my lungs and everything was going dark, I wasn't a CEO or a legacy or a corporate entity. I was just a person who desperately wanted to live." She turned to look at him. "You didn't save Evelyn Cross, Billionaire CEO. You saved a human being who was terrified and drowning and alone. And I think that's the perspective we both needed, to remember that behind all the corporate structures and profit margins and stock prices, there are just people who deserve to be safe when they board a plane." Emily used to say something similar, that the problem with modern society is we've gotten too good at abstracting away the human cost of our decisions. We talk about acceptable failure rates and risk management and liability exposure, and we forget that every number represents someone's mother or father or child. She was wise. She was. And she'd be furious about how long it took me to actually do something about what happened to her. You did something the moment you filed that safety report. The fact that the system failed to respond appropriately doesn't make your actions any less meaningful. Caleb wanted to believe that, wanted to accept that he'd done everything he could. But 3 years of silence and hiding had left scars that Evelyn's reassurance couldn't entirely heal. Still, sitting here now with the truth finally exposed and the machinery of justice grinding into motion, he could feel something loosening in his chest. Not quite forgiveness for his failures, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. His phone buzzed again, and this time he checked it. The message was from Sarah Chen. "Need to talk. Important. Call me when you can." He excused himself and stepped onto the safe house's back deck, the mountain air cold against his skin. Sarah answered on the first ring. "I've been going through the evidence you and Ms. Cross provided," she said without preamble. "The pattern is even worse than we thought. There are 12 crashes over the past 5 years that show the same turbine mounting bracket failure. 12, Caleb. Over 600 people dead." The number hit him like a physical blow. He'd known about 7 incidents, including Emily's flight. But 12? 600 lives? "How did we miss 5 crashes?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Because Cross Aerospace was very good at creating alternative explanations. Pilot error, maintenance failures, bird strikes, weather conditions. They had enough money and influence to shape the narrative on each incident to prevent investigators from looking too closely at the common factor. Sarah's voice was tight with anger. And in at least 3 cases, they paid off family members to settle quietly with NDAs attached. Bought their silence with blood money. "Can you prove all this?" "With what you've given me?" "Yes. The internal documents show a pattern of deliberate obfuscation and evidence suppression. We're talking about criminal conspiracy on a scale that's unprecedented in aviation history." Caleb closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all those deaths settle onto his shoulders. 600 people. 600 families destroyed. And all of it could have been prevented if someone had just listened to his report 3.5 years ago. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we build cases against everyone involved. And I mean everyone. Executives who authorized the cover-ups, lawyers who crafted the settlement agreements, FAA inspectors who looked the other way, even the insurance companies who paid out claims without questioning the pattern. This is going to take years, Caleb, and you're going to be the central witness in almost every case. I'll do whatever it takes. I know you will. But you need to understand what that means. Your life isn't going back to normal anytime soon. You're going to be testifying in criminal trials, civil suits, congressional hearings. Your face is going to be on the news for months, maybe years. And there are going to be people, powerful people, with resources and connections who will do everything they can to discredit you. Let them try. I've got the truth on my side. Truth isn't always enough. These people have lawyers who specialize in destroying witnesses. They'll dig into every aspect of your past, look for anything they can use to paint you as unreliable or biased or mentally unstable. They'll use your grief over your wife, your years of isolation, even your son's health issues to suggest you're not credible. The thought of them using Noah as a weapon against him made Caleb's blood run cold. I won't let them hurt my son. Then you need to be prepared. Get a good lawyer, someone who specializes in protecting whistleblowers. Make sure every aspect of your testimony is airtight, and most importantly, don't let them provoke you into anger or emotional outbursts. Stay calm, stay factual, and trust that the evidence will speak for itself. After he hung up, Caleb stood on the deck for a long time, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere below, Lake Sentinel reflected their light, peaceful and unchanging. It was hard to believe that less than 2 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been whether Noah would remember to take his inhaler to school. Now he was at the center of a scandal that would reshape an entire industry, facing years of testimony and legal battles and public scrutiny. But he'd made his choice, had made it the moment he'd pulled Evelyn from that wreckage, had reaffirmed it every step since. There was no going back, only forward into whatever consequences awaited. He went back inside to find Evelyn on her own phone, her expression troubled. When she saw him, she ended her call and gestured for him to sit. "That was my attorney," she said. "The SEC has frozen all of Cross Aerospace's assets pending investigation. The company is effectively bankrupt. We have maybe 2 weeks before we have to start laying off employees." "How many employees?" 15,000, give or take. Most of them had nothing to do with the cover-up. They're engineers and technicians and support staff who just came to work every day trying to do their jobs. And now they're going to lose everything because of decisions made by executives they never even met. The collateral damage of their truth-telling was something Caleb had considered in the abstract, but hearing the concrete numbers made it real. 15,000 people whose lives would be upended. 15,000 families facing uncertainty because he and Evelyn had chosen to expose the corruption. "We knew this would happen," he said quietly. "Knowing it intellectually and facing it practically are different things." Evelyn's hands were shaking slightly. "I'm going to have to stand in front of those employees and tell them that the company their parents and grandparents worked for, the legacy they believed in, was built on lies and dead bodies. And then I'm going to have to tell them they're losing their jobs. You're also going to tell them the truth, that they deserved better leadership, that they deserve to work for a company that valued integrity over profits, and that what comes next will be built on a better foundation." Pretty words, but words don't pay mortgages or feed families. Caleb understood her guilt, shared it even, but he also knew that the alternative, continuing to hide the truth, would have meant more deaths, more families destroyed, more futures stolen by preventable crashes. The employees of Cross Aerospace were casualties of the corruption they were exposing, but they weren't the enemy. They were victims too, just in a different way than the people who died in those crashes. "My attorney also had some news about your situation," Evelyn continued. "Apparently several of the families of crash victims have reached out wanting to meet you. They want to thank you for finally exposing what happened to their loved ones." Caleb felt his throat tighten. He'd been so focused on the legal and corporate aspects of this fight that he hadn't really thought about the human side. The families who'd been living with the same grief and unanswered questions he'd carried for 3 years. People who deserved to know that their loved ones' deaths weren't just random accidents, but preventable tragedies caused by conscious decisions to prioritize profits over safety. "I'll meet with them," he said, after things settle down a bit and Noah's back home safely. "They deserve answers." They talked for another hour, going over strategy and logistics and the thousand details that came with dismantling a corporate empire. By the time Caleb went to check on Noah, it was past 10 and he expected to find his son asleep. Instead, Noah was sitting up in bed, his small face illuminated by the nightlight shaped like a rocket ship that Mrs. Patterson had found in the safe house's storage. "Can't sleep?" Caleb asked, settling onto the edge of the bed. "I keep thinking about what Evelyn said, about how it's never too late to do the right thing." "What about it?" "Is it too late for me to do the right thing about Mom?" The question caught Caleb completely off guard. "What do you mean, buddy?" "I never told you this, but the day before Mom got on the plane, she asked me to draw her a picture to take with her. Said she wanted something from me to keep her company while she was gone." Noah's voice was small and guilty. "But I was playing video games and I told her I'd do it later, and then I forgot. And then she left and never came back, and she didn't have any picture from me." Caleb's heart broke for his son, for the weight of guilt a 7-year-old had been carrying for 3 years. He pulled Noah into his arms, holding him close. "Oh, buddy, that's not something you need to feel bad about. Mom knew you loved her. One picture wouldn't have changed that. But I could have made her happy, and I didn't. I was selfish. You were 4 years old and being a normal kid. Mom would never have wanted you to feel guilty about that. But now it's too late to fix it. She's gone, and I can't ever draw her that picture." Caleb pulled back to look at his son's face, seeing the tears tracking down his small cheeks. This was what trauma did to children. It had made them carry burdens they were too young to understand, blame themselves for things that weren't their fault, search for control in situations where none existed. "You're right that you can't give that picture to Mom now," Caleb said carefully. "But it's not too late to honor her memory. What if we drew pictures together, not for her to take with her, but for us to remember her by? We could draw all the things she loved, all the good memories we have of her, and we could keep them in a special place where we can look at them when we miss her." Noah considered this, his young mind processing whether this could count as making things right. "Would that be okay? Would Mom be happy with that?" "I think Mom would be proud of you for thinking of it, and I think she'd love any picture you drew, whether she got it before she died or we made it to remember her by. Can we start tomorrow?" "We can start right now if you want." Mrs. Patterson materialized with paper and crayons with the impeccable timing of someone who'd raised children and understood when they needed creative outlets for big emotions. Father and son sat on the bed together, drawing pictures by the light of the rocket ship nightlight. Noah drew his mother's smile, the garden she'd kept behind their old house, the way she'd looked when she read him bedtime stories. Caleb drew too, finding comfort in the simple act of putting memories on paper. Emily laughing at one of Noah's jokes, Emily in her classroom surrounded by adoring second graders, Emily on their wedding day, her expression full of joy and hope for the future they were building together. By the time Noah finally fell asleep, there were a dozen drawings scattered across the bed, a paper memorial to a woman who'd deserved so much more than she'd gotten. Caleb gathered them carefully and found a folder in the safe house's office supplies, placing each drawing inside with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects. Tomorrow there would be more investigations, more testimony, more hard conversations about consequences and accountability. But tonight, there was just this. A father and son remembering someone they'd loved and lost, finding small ways to make meaning from tragedy, choosing to honor the past while still moving forward. Evelyn found him in the kitchen around midnight, making coffee because sleep seemed impossible. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him waiting for the pot to brew, a silent companionship that was somehow more comforting than words could have been. "Thank you," Caleb said finally, "for everything you're doing, for protecting Noah, for standing beside us through all this, for choosing to be better than your company's history. I'm not doing this to earn thanks. I'm doing it because it's right, because you showed me that sometimes the cost of doing nothing is higher than the cost of doing everything. Still, it matters that you're here." They stood in the quiet kitchen, two unlikely allies brought together by tragedy and coincidence, drinking coffee and watching the mountain darkness through the windows. Tomorrow the world would continue to unravel the lies of Cross Aerospace. Tomorrow more evidence would emerge, more arrests would be made, more families would learn the truth about how their loved ones had died. But tonight, in this safe house perched in the mountains, there was peace. Temporary, and fragile, but real. Noah slept soundly for the first time in days. The people responsible for Emily's death were beginning to face justice. And Caleb Morgan, engineer, father, reluctant whistleblower, could finally feel like maybe, just maybe, the price he'd paid for 3 years of silence was being balanced by the truth he'd helped expose. It wouldn't bring Emily back, wouldn't undo the damage or erase the grief, but it would ensure that her death and the deaths of 600 others would mean something, would force change, would save future lives. And sometimes, that was the only kind of justice the universe offered. The chance to turn tragedy into meaning, to transform loss into purpose, to choose again and again to do the hard right thing over the easy wrong thing. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering and human courage alike. But inside, in the warm glow of the kitchen light, two people who'd been given unexpected second chances stood together and chose to make them count. The fight was far from over. But for tonight, they'd done enough. For tonight, they could rest. The weeks that followed the press conference blurred together in a relentless cascade of testimonies, depositions, and legal proceedings that consumed nearly every waking hour. Caleb found himself living between two worlds: the safe house where Noah remained under protection, and the countless offices and courtrooms where he recounted the same story over and over to different audiences: federal prosecutors, congressional committees, civil attorneys representing the families of crash victims, journalists documenting what was already being called the largest corporate fraud case in aviation history. Through it all, the evidence mounted like snowfall in winter, each piece adding to an accumulation that became impossible to deny. Internal emails showed executives joking about acceptable losses and manageable liability exposure. Financial records revealed systematic payments to families who'd agreed to sign NDAs rather than pursue public litigation. Phone logs connected Gregory Mathers to the security firm that had planted the GPS tracker on Evelyn's plane, with text messages discussing permanent solutions to persistent problems. The human cost became impossible to abstract away. 643 people dead across 12 crashes. 643 families destroyed by decisions made in boardrooms by people who'd never had to look into the eyes of a grieving child and explain why mommy wasn't coming home. But it was the 13th crash, the one that never happened, that finally broke the dam of institutional resistance. 3 weeks after the press conference, an airline in Singapore grounded a G650 during routine maintenance when an inspector found stress fractures in the turbine mounting brackets identical to those Caleb had documented years earlier. The aircraft had been scheduled to fly the next morning with 312 passengers aboard. The engineers who examined the brackets confirmed that catastrophic failure would have occurred within the next 50 flight hours, almost certainly during takeoff or landing when the engines were under maximum stress. 312 people who went to bed that night had no idea how close they'd come to death. 312 families who would never know they'd been saved by a whistleblower's determination and a CEO's conscience. The near miss made international headlines and transformed the narrative. This wasn't ancient history or theoretical risk. This was an active, ongoing threat that had been averted only by exposing the truth. Airlines around the world accelerated their fleet inspections. Governments launched their own investigations, and the court of public opinion, which had been divided between those who saw Caleb as a hero and those who saw him as a disgruntled employee with an agenda, shifted decisively toward demanding accountability. Caleb was in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. when he got the news about Singapore. He'd been testifying about the technical specifications of the turbine mounting system, explaining to a judge in painstaking detail how the design flaw propagated over time. His phone buzzed with the news alert during a break, and he had to step outside to steady himself against a wall, overwhelmed by the realization that they'd actually done it. They'd actually saved lives. Evelyn found him there, her own face pale with the same realization. She'd been in an adjacent courtroom dealing with her own testimony about what she'd known and when she'd known it. The SEC was pursuing charges against her for continuing operations after taking over as CEO. Even though she'd been deliberately kept in the dark about the extent of the cover-up. Her legal team was confident they could demonstrate her lack of knowledge, but the process was grueling nonetheless. "Did you see?" she asked, holding up her own phone with the Singapore headline. "Yeah." Caleb's voice was rough. 312 people. 312 people who get to go home tonight, who get to hug their families and plan their futures and live their lives. Evelyn leaned against the wall beside him, and for a moment they just stood there, two exhausted people processing the magnitude of what their choices had set in motion. We did that. Everything we've been through, all the testimony and attacks and sleepless nights, it was worth it for this. It doesn't bring back the 600 who already died. No, but it might save the thousands who would have died if we'd stayed silent. She turned to look at him. That has to count for something. Before Caleb could respond, Robert Kane appeared around the corner, his expression urgent. We need to move, now. What's wrong? James Cross just issued a statement. He's claiming full responsibility for the cover-up, says he made all the decisions without board approval, and that Evelyn and the other executives were following his orders. He's trying to take the fall to protect everyone else. Evelyn's face went white. That son of a bitch! He thinks he can play the noble sacrifice and let everyone else walk free? There's more. He's checked himself into a hospital claiming stress-related health issues. His lawyers are already arguing he's too ill to face trial. They're going to try to run out the clock on his mortality. The cynicism of it was breathtaking. James Cross, architect of a conspiracy that had killed hundreds, was attempting to engineer one final cover-up, casting himself as the sole villain while protecting the infrastructure of corruption he'd built. And because he was 78 years old with a documented heart condition, he might actually succeed in avoiding consequences. We need to get ahead of this, Evelyn said, already pulling out her phone. I'm going to make a statement. He doesn't get to rewrite history. Ms. Cross, your lawyers would strongly advise against— I don't care what my lawyers advise. This ends now, with the truth, all of it. She was already dialing, and when someone answered, she spoke with absolute authority. This is Evelyn Cross. I'm calling an emergency press conference for this evening. Get every outlet you can reach. This is going to be big. 6 hours later, Caleb stood beside Evelyn in front of a wall of cameras once again, though this time the setting was a hotel conference room in D.C. rather than a Denver ballroom. The contrast to their first press conference was striking, where they'd been nervous and uncertain then. Now they carried the weight of weeks of testimony and mounting evidence. They knew their story was airtight. They knew the truth was on their side. Evelyn stepped to the microphone with the bearing of someone who'd made peace with whatever consequences were coming. My father, James Cross, issued a statement this afternoon claiming sole responsibility for the decisions that led to hundreds of deaths. He's attempting to portray himself as a rogue executive acting without board knowledge or approval. This is a lie. She pulled out a document and held it up to the cameras. This is a board meeting transcript from 4 years ago, 2 months after Caleb Morgan filed his initial safety report. In this meeting, my father presented the findings to the full board. Gregory Mathers moved to implement a quiet monitoring program rather than grounding the fleet. 5 other board members voted in favor. 2 abstained. Not a single person voted to do the right thing. The room erupted in shouted questions, but Evelyn pressed on. My father didn't act alone. He couldn't have. This conspiracy required the cooperation of executives, lawyers, accountants, safety inspectors, and board members across multiple jurisdictions and agencies. What he's attempting now is one final cover-up, protecting the system that enabled these deaths by pretending he was the system. What about your own role, a reporter shouted. Did you know about the cover-up when you became CEO? I didn't know the full extent until Caleb provided me with evidence after the crash. But I should have known. I should have dug deeper, asked harder questions, refused to accept the explanations I was given. Evelyn's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I was complicit through willful ignorance, and I will face whatever legal consequences that warrants. But I won't let my father's final act of manipulation protect people who made conscious choices to value money over human lives. Caleb watched her speak and felt a fierce pride in this woman who'd chosen to burn down her own legacy rather than let corruption hide behind noble lies. When she finally stepped back from the microphone, he took her place. James Cross and his co-conspirators made a calculation, Caleb said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. They decided that some people's lives were worth less than their profit margins. They decided that my wife, and the mother on the Singapore flight, and the grandfather flying to see his grandchildren, and the teacher heading to a conference, they decided all of those people were acceptable losses in service of quarterly earnings reports. He pulled out his own document, the original safety report he'd filed 3.5 years ago, complete with James Cross's signature authorizing its classification and burial. This report could have prevented every death that followed, every single one. The technical analysis was sound. The recommendations were clear. The cost of implementation was calculated and deemed acceptable from an engineering standpoint. The only thing that stopped it from being implemented was a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice to prioritize short-term profits over long-term safety. "Mr. Morgan, what do you want to see happen now?" another reporter called out. "I want to see justice. Real justice. Not the kind that lets old men hide behind health conditions and legal technicalities. I want to see prison time for everyone who knew about this cover-up and chose to maintain it. I want to see regulatory reform that prevents this from ever happening again. And I want to see a future where whistleblowers are protected rather than destroyed, where safety concerns are addressed rather than buried, where human lives matter more than stock prices." The press conference continued for another hour, with both Caleb and Evelyn fielding questions that ranged from technical to personal. By the end, the narrative had shifted again. No longer was this just about one corrupt CEO, but about systematic failures that demanded systematic solutions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, 3 more board members who'd been named in Evelyn's testimony resigned and hired lawyers. The hospital where James Cross had checked himself in was surrounded by protesters demanding he face trial. Federal prosecutors announced they were expanding their investigation to include everyone named in the board meeting transcript. And most importantly, the families of crash victims began organizing, forming a coalition that would push for legislative changes to prevent future corporate cover-ups. But the real turning point came 2 days later when Gregory Mathers, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, agreed to a plea deal in exchange for complete cooperation. He provided prosecutors with recordings of board meetings, copies of destroyed documents he'd kept as insurance, and testimony that implicated not just Cross Aerospace executives, but FAA inspectors who'd been bribed to overlook safety violations. The conspiracy was larger and deeper than anyone had imagined, and Mathers' cooperation meant it could all be exposed and prosecuted. Within a week, arrest warrants were issued for 12 more individuals. Within 2 weeks, the FAA's administrator had resigned. Within a month, Congress had passed emergency legislation creating independent safety review boards and strengthening whistleblower protections. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, proved unstoppable. Throughout all of this, Caleb made the drive back to the safe house every few days to see Noah, each visit a painful reminder of how much his son's childhood was being consumed by something that should never have been his burden to carry. But Noah was resilient in the way children often are, finding ways to adapt and make sense of a world that had become complicated and frightening. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson says you're a hero," Noah said during one visit, his 7-year-old face serious. "But you don't look like the heroes in my books. You look tired." "Real heroes usually do," Caleb replied, pulling his son onto his lap. "Being heroic isn't about being strong all the time. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared and tired and want to give up." "Are you scared?" "Sometimes. But then I think about you and about Mom and about all the people we're helping, and that makes it worth it." Noah was quiet for a moment, then asked, "When can we go home?" It was the question Caleb had been dreading because he didn't have a good answer. The safe house was secure but sterile, a place designed for protection rather than living. Noah needed his own room, his own toys, the familiar comfort of the cabin by the lake. But Robert Kane kept finding new threats, new reasons to extend their stay. Anonymous messages sent to Caleb's phone, suspicious vehicles spotted near their property, reports of individuals asking questions about Noah's school and daily routine. "Soon, buddy, I promise." "Sacred promise?" Caleb looked into his son's eyes, Emily's eyes, and made a decision. Sacred promise. 1 more week, and then we go home no matter what. That decision nearly proved fatal. The attempt came 5 days later, on a Tuesday evening when Caleb was returning to the safe house after a particularly brutal day of testimony. He'd spent 8 hours being cross-examined by defense attorneys for 3 of the indicted board members, lawyers who tried every tactic to discredit his expertise and paint him as an obsessed conspiracy theorist. By the time he left the courthouse, Caleb was exhausted to his bones and focused only on getting back to Noah, which was why he didn't notice the car following him until it was too late. The attack happened on a mountain road 3 miles from the safe house, in a stretch where the shoulder dropped away into a steep ravine. The pursuing vehicle accelerated and rammed Caleb's truck from behind, sending it skidding toward the edge. Caleb fought the wheel, his engineering mind automatically calculating angles and momentum and the rapidly diminishing space between his tires and the drop-off. The second impact came from the side, a precision strike designed to push him over the edge. Caleb's truck tipped, balanced for one impossible moment on 2 wheels, and then gravity made its claim. The vehicle tumbled down the ravine in a chaos of shattering glass and screaming metal, each impact against rocks and trees stealing momentum and consciousness in equal measure. When Caleb finally came to, he was hanging upside down in his seatbelt, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead into his eyes. The truck had come to rest against a large pine tree about 30 feet down the ravine, precariously balanced. Above him, through the shattered windshield, he could see figures moving on the road, his attackers checking to confirm the kill. His phone was somewhere in the wreckage, probably destroyed. His left arm was screaming with pain that suggested broken bones. And he could smell gasoline, which meant a fire was likely imminent. He had minutes at most to either escape or die trying. The thought of Noah, of his son waiting at the safe house, of the sacred promise Caleb had made, gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He managed to release the seatbelt, catching himself against the truck's crushed roof with his good arm. The driver's side door was jammed shut, but the windshield frame had separated enough that he could squeeze through if he didn't care about the glass cutting into him. He didn't care about the glass. Caleb dragged himself out of the wreckage just as flames began licking up from the engine compartment. His left arm was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places, and his ribs sent sharp pains through his chest with every breath. But he was alive, and the figures on the road above couldn't see him in the growing darkness. He heard them calling to each other, confirming the vehicle was on fire, deciding to leave before emergency services arrived. Then engines started and vehicles drove away, leaving Caleb alone on the mountainside with a burning truck and no way to call for help. The walk back to the safe house took 3 hours that felt like 3 lifetimes. Caleb followed the road at a distance, staying in the tree line where he couldn't be seen if his attackers returned. Every step was agony. His vision kept blurring from the head wound. Twice he had to stop and vomit from what was probably a concussion. But he kept moving because Noah was waiting, because he'd made a sacred promise, because stopping meant dying and he'd already cheated death once today. The safe house security team saw him emerge from the trees and immediately went into crisis mode. Robert Kane himself ran out to catch Caleb before he collapsed, his gruff voice cracking with something that might have been fear. "Jesus Christ, Morgan, we saw the fire, thought you were dead. Who did this?" "Don't know. 2 vehicles, professional." Caleb's words were slurred, consciousness fading as adrenaline wore off. "Need to see Noah. Need to tell him the medics are on their way. Just stay with me." "Noah. Now." Caleb pushed against Kane's restraining arms with desperate strength. "I promised him. Sacred promise." Something in Kane's expression shifted. Understanding, maybe, or respect for a father's determination. He half carried Caleb inside where Mrs. Patterson had already gotten Noah out of bed and was trying to calm the frightened boy. "Dad!" Noah's cry was pure terror and relief mixed together. "You're bleeding." "I'm okay, buddy. Just a little accident." Caleb sank to his knees. Standing was becoming impossible, and opened his good arm. Noah crashed into him, and the pain of broken ribs was nothing compared to the relief of holding his son alive and safe. "I'm okay." "You promised we could go home soon. You promised." "I know, and we will. Sacred promise still stands." Caleb looked up at Kane over his son's head. This was a message. They want me scared enough to stop testifying, which means they're desperate, which means we're winning. "Winning isn't worth much if you're dead," Kane pointed out. "Then make sure I don't die. Because I'm not stopping. Not now, not ever." The medics arrived and tried to separate Caleb from Noah to work on his injuries, but the boy refused to let go until Evelyn appeared and gently convinced him that his father needed medical attention. She stayed with Noah while Caleb was patched up, broken arm, splinted, ribs wrapped, head wound stitched and bandaged. The medics wanted to transport him to a hospital, but Caleb refused. Hospitals were too exposed, too public, too easy for a second attempt. Once the medics had done what they could, Evelyn pulled Kane aside for a conversation that Caleb could hear from across the room, despite their attempted privacy. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice tight with fury. "They tried to kill him, in broad daylight on a public road. What's next? Attacking the safe house? We're secure here, but you're right that the threat level has escalated beyond what we anticipated." Kane pulled out his phone. "I'm calling in federal protection. Marshals, FBI, full security detail. No more relying on private contractors. Do it. And Robert, find out who ordered this. I don't care what it takes or what laws we have to bend. I want names." Already working on it. The vehicles were stolen, but someone had to coordinate the attack. Someone with resources and inside information about Morgan's schedule. Kane's expression was grim. "I've got contacts who can dig up that information quietly." Not quietly, loudly. "I want whoever did this to know we're coming for them, and that there's nowhere they can hide." Caleb closed his eyes and let their voices wash over him, feeling oddly detached from his own near-death experience. He'd survived. Noah was safe. The testimony would continue. That was all that mattered. He must have dozed off despite the pain, because when he woke it was morning and Noah was curled up on a chair beside the couch where Caleb lay, refusing to leave his father's side even for sleep. Evelyn was there too, working on her laptop with the focused intensity of someone channeling fear into productivity. "How long was I out?" Caleb asked, his voice raspy. "About 6 hours. The doctor said you have a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a compound fracture in your left arm. You should be in a hospital." "Can't risk it." "I know, which is why I hired a private nurse to stay here and monitor you. She's in the next room if you need anything." Evelyn closed her laptop and moved to sit on the edge of the couch, carefully avoiding his injuries. "Robert identified the people who attacked you. They're mercenaries hired through 3 layers of shell companies, but he traced the payments back to an offshore account owned by one of the executives we indicted last month. The FBI is moving to arrest him now." "Good." "It's not good. It's dangerous and terrifying and exactly what I was afraid would happen." Her composure cracked slightly, showing the fear beneath. "Caleb, they tried to kill you. They came within feet of succeeding, and they'll try again if we give them the chance." "So we don't give them the chance. We finish this. We make sure everyone responsible goes to prison where they can't hurt anyone else." "At what cost? Your life? Noah's safety? When does the price become too high?" Caleb understood her fear. He shared it. But he also understood something she maybe didn't yet. Something that had crystallized in his mind during those 3 agonizing hours, walking back to the safe house with a broken arm and a concussion. "The price became too high when my wife died in a preventable crash. Every moment I've spent hiding or staying silent since then has been me choosing my own comfort over other people's lives. I won't make that choice anymore, even if it costs me everything. You can't protect everyone. You can't save everyone. No. But I can tell the truth and trust that it matters. That's all I've ever been able to do. That's all any of us can do." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. "You're a better person than I am. I would have run. If someone tried to kill me like they tried to kill you, I would have taken Noah and disappeared and convinced myself that survival was more important than justice. You pulled yourself out of a sinking plane and then chose to destroy your own company rather than let the corruption continue. You're plenty brave. I had you showing me how. I don't think I could have done it alone. Good thing you didn't have to." Noah stirred in his chair, waking slowly and immediately looking for his father. When he saw Caleb was awake, his small face lit up with relief before darkening with worry as he took in the bandages and splints. "Does it hurt really bad?" Noah asked. "Not too bad. The medicine helps." A lie, but a kind one. "Come here, buddy." Noah climbed carefully onto the couch, fitting himself against Caleb's good side with the practiced care of a child who'd learned to navigate around injuries. They lay there together, father and son, while Evelyn quietly made phone calls and arranged for increased security and coordinated with prosecutors about Caleb's testimony schedule. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Caleb found himself drifting in and out of consciousness as his body worked to heal. Each time he woke, Noah was there, or Evelyn was there, or sometimes both, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight, that other people were standing beside him even when the cost became almost unbearable. 2 days later, Robert Kane walked into the safe house with news that changed everything. James Cross had a heart attack, he announced without preamble. Massive coronary. He's dead. The silence that followed was heavy with complicated emotions. Relief that the architect of the conspiracy would never escape justice through technicalities. Grief that he'd avoided full accountability by dying before trial. And underneath it all, a strange emptiness, the realization that the enemy they'd been fighting had been reduced to a mortal old man who'd died afraid and disgraced. Was it really a heart attack? Evelyn asked, her voice carefully neutral. Or did someone decide to tie up loose ends? Autopsy will tell us, but preliminary reports suggest it was natural causes, probably stress-induced. He knew what was coming, the trials, the public disgrace, the destruction of everything he'd built. Some people can't survive that knowledge. Evelyn stood and walked to the window, looking out at mountains that had witnessed all of this human drama with ancient indifference. He was my father. I should feel something. Grief or loss, or at least regret. But all I feel is tired. Tired of fighting his legacy. Tired of trying to fix what he broke. You don't have to fix it all, Caleb said. You just have to help make sure it doesn't happen again. Is that enough? Is that sufficient atonement for all the damage? Atonement isn't transactional. You can't balance a ledger of harm and good deeds and come out clean. You can only choose every day to do better than you did yesterday. That's all any of us can do. James Cross's death accelerated the legal proceedings in ways no one had anticipated. With the primary defendant gone, prosecutors focused on building cases against the remaining co-conspirators. The board members who'd voted to maintain the cover-up, the lawyers who'd crafted the NDAs, the FAA inspectors who'd taken bribes. The conspiracy unraveled thread by thread, and each thread pulled led to more arrests, more indictments, more evidence of systematic corruption. Gregory Mathers testified in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed accounts of meetings where human lives were explicitly discussed as acceptable losses. His testimony was devastating, painting a picture of corporate culture so toxic that dissent was punished, and safety concerns were treated as threats to profitability rather than warnings to be heeded. The trials dominated news cycles for months. Convictions came down like dominoes, 3 board members sentenced to 15 years each, 2 executives sentenced to 20, an FAA inspector sentenced to 10 for accepting bribes. The penalties were severe, sending a clear message that corporate negligence resulting in death would be prosecuted with the full weight of the law. But it was the civil suits that really changed the landscape. Families of crash victims, emboldened by the criminal convictions, filed wrongful death lawsuits that sought not just compensation, but punitive damages designed to deter future misconduct. The settlements and judgments totaled billions, forcing the complete dissolution of Cross Aerospace and the distribution of its assets to victims' families. Through it all, Caleb testified over and over again in courtroom after courtroom. His broken arm healed, his concussion faded. The attempt on his life became another piece of evidence in the conspiracy prosecution. And slowly, painfully, justice ground forward. 10 months after that morning by the lake when Caleb had pulled a drowning woman from a sinking jet, he and Noah finally went home. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, though somehow smaller and more peaceful than Caleb remembered. The lake stretched out before them, calm and reflective, giving no indication of the violence it had witnessed or the changes it had set in motion. Noah ran immediately to the dock to skip stones, and Caleb followed more slowly, still favoring his left arm, though the cast had been removed weeks ago. "It's good to be home," Noah said, not looking up from his careful selection of flat stones. "I missed the lake." "Me too, buddy." "Are we safe now? Are the bad people all in jail?" "Most of them, and the ones who aren't are being watched very carefully. We're safe." Noah skipped a stone across the water, 3 bounces, then 4, then 5 before it sank. "Mrs. Patterson says you changed the world. Is that true?" "I don't know about change the world, but maybe we made it a little bit safer, a little bit better." "Mom would like that." "Yeah, she would." They stood together on the dock, father and son, watching the sun paint the water gold and orange as it descended toward the western peaks. In the distance, Caleb could hear the sound of a vehicle approaching. Evelyn, coming for the dinner they'd arranged to mark their return home. She'd been released from federal custody 2 months ago. All charges dropped when prosecutors concluded she'd genuinely been kept ignorant of the cover-up until Caleb had provided evidence. Her cooperation since then had been complete and invaluable. She emerged from her car carrying a bottle of wine and a grocery bag that probably contained ingredients for a meal more sophisticated than anything Caleb usually attempted. She'd changed since that first press conference, was thinner, more worn, but somehow more genuine. The corporate polish had been stripped away by months of testimony and public scrutiny, leaving behind someone who seemed more comfortable in jeans and a simple shirt than she'd ever looked in designer suits. "Welcome home," she said, greeting them both with careful hugs that respected Caleb's still healing ribs. "The place looks good, peaceful." "It is now," Caleb gestured toward the cabin. "Come on in. Fair warning, I haven't cooked a real meal in almost a year, so if this dinner is terrible, I'm blaming you for bringing fancy ingredients. I'll help. Between the two of us, we can probably manage something edible." They cooked together in the small cabin kitchen, an easy domesticity that would have felt strange months ago, but now seemed natural. Noah set the table with serious concentration, placing silverware and napkins with the precision of someone performing an important ritual. And when they finally sat down to eat, pasta with vegetables and herbs that actually tasted good, it felt like something approaching normal. "I got official word today," Evelyn said halfway through the meal. "The Aviation Safety Foundation is fully funded and operational. The board of directors is in place, the charter has been approved, and we're ready to start accepting applications for safety review positions." "That's amazing," Caleb said. "How many positions?" 30 initially, with plans to expand to 50 within 2 years. We'll be reviewing aircraft designs, investigating safety concerns, providing independent analysis free from corporate or regulatory pressure. Everything you wanted to build when you first filed that report. Everything Emily would have wanted. We're calling it the Morgan Safety Foundation, in her honor and in honor of all the victims whose deaths could have been prevented. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He'd known this was coming, they'd discussed it during the planning stages, but hearing it made real was different. Emily's name would live on, attached to something that would save lives. It felt right in a way he hadn't expected. "What about you?" he asked Evelyn. "What's next?" "I'm joining the foundation staff. Not as an executive. I've had enough of executive positions to last a lifetime, but as a consultant on corporate culture and accountability, helping other companies avoid the mistakes my father made, or at least making it harder for them to hide those mistakes. That's good work. It's necessary work, and it's the least I can do." She took a sip of wine, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said about atonement not being transactional, about how we just have to choose every day to be better. I think I'm finally understanding what that means." "Yeah?" "It means accepting that I can't fix what's broken. I can't bring back the people who died. I can't undo the damage my company caused. But I can spend the rest of my life working to make sure it doesn't happen again. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough." They talked late into the evening, discussing the foundation's plans and the ongoing trials and the regulatory reforms that were being implemented across the aviation industry. Noah fell asleep on the couch, exhausted by the excitement of being home, and Evelyn helped Caleb carry him to bed. Standing in Noah's doorway, watching his son sleep with the rocket ship nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not quite happiness. The grief of Emily's loss would never fully disappear. But something close to peace. A sense that the choices he'd made, painful as they'd been, had mattered. That his sacrifice and Noah's displacement and all the hard, terrible work of the past year had resulted in something meaningful. "Thank you," he said quietly to Evelyn, "for believing me, for standing beside me, for being brave enough to burn down your own legacy. Thank you for pulling me out of that lake, for giving me a second chance I didn't deserve." She paused, then added, "For showing me what courage actually looks like." They walked back to the living room together, and through the windows Caleb could see the lake reflecting starlight, the same water that had nearly claimed Evelyn's life. The same water he jumped into without hesitation because someone needed help. It all seemed so long ago now, and yet also like yesterday, the beginning of everything that had come after. "Do you ever regret it?" Evelyn asked. "Pulling me out? If you'd known what it would cost, what you'd have to sacrifice, would you still have done it?" Caleb thought about the question seriously, considering all the pain and fear and danger that had followed that single act of courage. The attack on the mountain road, Noah's displacement to a safe house, the months of testimony and threats and public scrutiny. The price had been high, almost unbearably so. But then he thought about the Singapore flight. 312 people who'd gone home that night because the truth had been exposed. Thought about the regulatory reforms being implemented worldwide. Thought about the foundation that would bear Emily's name and work to prevent future tragedies. Thought about Noah growing up knowing his father had chosen to do what was right, even when it was hard. "Yes," he said finally. "I'd do it again. Every part of it. Even knowing you'd be attacked, that Noah would be endangered. Even knowing that, because the alternative was letting you die and hoping someone else would eventually expose the truth. And I've learned that hope without action is just another form of cowardice." Evelyn nodded, accepting this. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd been forged into something stronger by the fire they'd walked through together. Not friends exactly. The relationship was too complicated for that simple word, but allies, survivors. People who'd chosen courage over comfort and somehow made it through to the other side. She left around midnight, promising to return the following week to discuss Caleb's role with the foundation. He'd agreed to serve as chief technical advisor, reviewing safety concerns and providing engineering analysis. It was work he could do from the cabin, allowing him to maintain the quiet life Noah needed while still contributing to the mission of preventing future tragedies. After Evelyn's taillights disappeared down the mountain road, Caleb walked out onto the dock one more time. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead in patterns that had existed long before human tragedy and would continue long after. He thought about Emily, about how she'd believed in systems and truth and the power of doing what was right, about how she'd been proven both tragically wrong and ultimately correct. Wrong that the system would work as designed, but right that truth would eventually matter if someone was brave enough to tell it. "We did it," he said to the stars, to the memory of his wife, to the universe that had brought him to this moment. "It took way too long and cost way too much, but we did it. People are going to be safer now. Lives are going to be saved. Your death meant something." The lake offered no response except the gentle lap of waves against the dock posts. But somehow, standing there under the infinite sky, Caleb felt like maybe Emily heard him. Maybe she knew that her husband and son had survived, that justice had been served, that her belief in the power of truth hadn't been misplaced. He went inside, checked on Noah one more time, and finally allowed himself to sleep in his own bed for the first time in almost a year. His dreams were peaceful, free from the nightmares that had plagued him for so long. And when he woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of Noah laughing as he watched birds on the deck railing, Caleb felt something he'd almost forgotten was possible. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that sustained you through dark times, but the genuine article. Hope that the future would be better than the past. Hope that the work they'd done would save countless lives. Hope that Noah would grow up in a world slightly more committed to valuing human life over corporate profits. It was a small hope, tempered by realism and the knowledge that the fight would never be completely over. But it was real, and it was enough. 1 year later, Caleb stood at a podium in front of a new building bearing a plaque that read, "The Morgan Safety Foundation, dedicated to Emily Morgan and all those lost to preventable tragedy." Beside him stood Noah, now 8 years old and remarkably composed for a child about to help dedicate a building in his mother's name. Behind them, Evelyn and a board of directors that included 3 former NTSB investigators, 2 aerospace engineers, and a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protection. In the audience sat families of crash victims, some of whom Caleb had met during the trials, others who'd reached out afterward to thank him for finally exposing the truth about their loved ones' deaths. They'd come from across the country to witness this moment, the formal beginning of an institution dedicated to ensuring their tragedies would never be repeated. "My wife Emily believed in truth. Caleb said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. She believed that systems could work if good people made them work, that safety mattered more than convenience, that human lives were worth protecting even when protection was expensive or difficult. He looked down at Noah, who squeezed his hand in encouragement. She died because people made choices that valued money over her life, because a system that should have protected her failed, because whistleblowers were silenced and safety concerns were buried. This foundation exists to make sure that never happens again. We can't bring back the people we've lost, he continued. We can't undo the damage or erase the grief, but we can honor their memory by building something better from the wreckage, by creating systems that actually work, by protecting the people who have the courage to speak up when they see something wrong, by choosing every single day to value human lives over corporate profits. The crowd erupted in applause as Caleb and Noah pulled the cord that unveiled the building's dedication plaque. Camera flashes captured the moment, freezing it in time. A father and son standing together in front of a building that represented justice finally achieved, lives saved, a future built on truth rather than comfortable lies. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and shared stories and made plans for the Foundation's first safety reviews, Caleb found himself standing apart, watching it all with a sense of quiet satisfaction. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, despite attempts to silence and intimidate and kill them, they'd actually built something meaningful. Evelyn joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. Thinking about Emily? Always. But today especially. Wishing she could see this. Wishing she could know that her death, as pointless and preventable as it was, led to something good. I think she knows. If there's any justice in the universe, she knows. They stood together, watching the crowd, watching Noah talk animatedly with other children who'd lost parents in preventable crashes. The boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, learning about corporate conspiracies and assassination attempts and the cost of telling truth to power, but also learning about courage and integrity and the importance of doing what was right even when it was hard. What's next for you? Evelyn asked. This, the foundation, making sure the retrofit actually happens and is done right, being a father, living quietly in the mountains and trying not to attract any more assassination attempts. Caleb smiled slightly. Pretty boring compared to the past year. Boring sounds perfect. What about you? Same. The foundation, speaking engagements about corporate accountability, maybe eventually writing a book about what we learned. Nothing glamorous, but necessary work. The best work usually isn't glamorous. They lapsed into companionable silence. 2 people who'd been through hell together and come out the other side changed but intact. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more companies cutting corners, more executives prioritizing profits, more systems that needed reform. But they'd proven that change was possible, that truth could win even against overwhelming power, that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences if they refused to stay silent. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Caleb felt Emily's presence more strongly than he had in years. Not as grief or loss, but as a gentle reminder that some loves transcend death, that some legacies outlive their creators, that doing the right thing always mattered even when the cost was high. He'd pulled a stranger from a lake and set in motion events that changed an entire industry. He'd stood up to corporate corruption and survived attempts to silence him. He'd chosen truth over safety, courage over comfort, justice over peace. And in the end, he'd built something that would save lives for generations to come. It was enough. It had to be enough. And standing there watching his son laugh with new friends, watching the first day of operations begin at a foundation bearing his wife's name, watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph, Caleb Morgan allowed himself to believe that maybe, finally, the universe had balanced its scales. The water below was calm, reflecting the fading light like liquid gold. The same water that had started everything, transformed from a site of tragedy into a symbol of renewal. And as darkness settled over Lake Sentinel, bringing with it the first stars of evening, Caleb made a silent promise to Emily, to Noah, to all the people whose lives had been touched by their fight. The truth had been told, justice had been served, lives would be saved. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.